Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of what if Deku finally admitted he wasn't okay? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. It was raining. Or, rather, it was drizzling if one wanted to be technical about it. Apparently, there was a difference, according to Kayama. Except Kayama hadn't really said that so much as heard it from Zashi because she'd never have mentioned the word drizzle in her entire life. That FANG word was definitely something he'd say though. Not that Shoyuta gave a DMN about those differences in the wording or what they meant or who wanted to say them. Rain was rain, and either way, a cold slithering of water droplets haphazardly slipped from the sky, dampened shoulders and set the air with the musty smell of soil. It was, admittedly, refreshing and irksome all at once. It was decidedly wet, drizzle or no. Wet and damp and somewhat frosty enough to make the man tuck down into himself just a little more. In the drizzle and the chill, autumn's airy breeze nipping through sweaters and scarves, the prospect of sunshine already peeked through the cloud cover, grays giving way to the paler hues of creams and whites, fluffier bits of condensed water droplets that wouldn't leak and fall upon the world below. Warmth could and would come back eventually. The weather during this time of year was fickle like that. It would either rain for days, a steady stream of chilled water that fell down the back of your shirt, despite your best efforts to bundle up. Or water would fall sporadically, minuscule droplets that came and went, only staying long enough to clear the air and lend a refreshing scent to the sky. Though it did provoke the temperature to rise and fall on a whim, with near summer weather giving way to milder autumnal bite and back again. Today's current forecast? This was a milder case of rain cover, meeting somewhere between the deluge and the sprinkling, the drizzling. Just enough rain to form smaller puddles, where one could soak their socks if they weren't careful where they stepped, but not enough of a downpour to make one look like a drowned rat, sopping and soaked. Shoyuta wasn't overly fond of it all. He never liked feeling damp even if he did like the rain. Not one for feeling too warm, Shoyuta wasn't bothered too much by a small bit of chill in the air. But when it came to the dewiness of the air with water sprinkling from the sky, things got a little more annoying. On a positive note, for him anyway, it looked as though the rain might and would abate soon enough. Warmer weather even in this autumn season was soon at hand. The afternoon looked to be a brighter affair than this somewhat soggy and morose traipse towards campus. Still, despite the cheery prospect of avoiding more damp and more drizzle, Zashi loved his words, did he not? Shoyuta should have known it was going to be a bad day the minute he stepped onto campus and dropped his mug of coffee on the concrete, the shattering of the ceramic reverberating in his ears as the swirl of blue color split apart. Rich mocha liquid seeped outward and splashed across concrete in a spectacular display, leaving the underground hero to do nothing more but stand stock still and frown. Unfortunately, and stupidly so, because he should have known better, Shoyuta hadn't considered that today would be any different than any other day, which was mistake number one. He was overtired and snappish, the norm, and his students deemed it appropriate to spend the week being hellions, also the norm. Yes, it had already been a long week, only being Wednesday, with Shoyuta having to defuse more than one robbery and stop several assaults while on his shift the day prior, all while looking forward to the prospect of grading several essays and tests with as much vigor and excitement as any teacher could possess, that is to say, not any. He was looking forward to the weekend evening grading sessions with as much appeal as watching paint. But this was all normal. The attitudes and weariness were a familiarity, almost comfortingly so. There was stability in the rigors of his patrols and the raucous behavior of Bakugo and Kirishima and Kaminari chattering in class. There was a sense of ease dealing with the incessant questions from Yayorozu and Ida and Midoriya, or dissuading certain villains on patrol to make his night easier because he really didn't want to embarrass the others' ineptitude in escaping from the eraser hero. Not that it ever worked. Seemed that people were pretty stubborn, which was a bit of a nuisance. Still, it was funny to watch the way a criminal's face contorted into perturbed annoyance when he lobbied for an easier evening. I'm tired, you're slow. Let's just make this simple. Despite these familiar flavors and feelings seeping into the day, Shoyuta was also well acquainted with Murphy and his god-forsaken law. Anything that can go wrong, probably will. And the morning routine was already off-kilter thanks to his shattered ceramic and lack of caffeine. And no, the rain wasn't helping to improve things either. Drizzle. Shoyuta frowned and narrowed his gaze up towards the muted sky. The waterfall wasn't helping to improve the man's view of the world. Not that it ever did really. Shoyuta wasn't overly fond of rain, drizzle or deluge alike. He didn't mind it so much as he didn't appreciate the inconvenience of it. Like when it took away the comforts that kept his alert. Particularly the coffee. He wasn't overly fond of foregoing coffee and shattering his favorite mug all in one go. It made his displeasure of the drizzling mess all the more apparent. It was the orange and white mug too. The one that had been shaped like a cat, with a delicately painted face on the side, rosy cheeks and bright black eyes and a tail that curled up into the handle. Or rather, it had curled up into a handle anyway, you know, before it dropped onto the gray mess of a walkway that led towards the main building to UA's halls. The rich, warming coffee puddled among the shards. He'd been looking forward to drinking that, now more than ever after another frigid droplet of water slithered beneath his capture weapon and managed to trickle down his back. Med rain. Now it just mocked him, the rain and the coffee alike, the lingering aroma of the roasted brew and cream adding further ire to his agitation at losing the mug. He didn't even know how the thing had slipped through his fingers either, which bothered him even more. Shoyuta was usually so self-assured in his movements and dexterity. He rarely dropped an object, let alone one as useful and essential to his sanity and energy as a mug of coffee. And this deviation from familiarity should have sent bells ringing and alarms sounding. And in truth it did, much to his annoyance. He hated the way his shoulders immediately tensed, a spark of wariness striking his senses as he slowly and carefully knelt down to collect the colorful ceramic pieces, tucking each into a small napkin. Yes, there was a warning ringing, somewhere far off, echoing in the distance, but the man chose to ignore it in favor of resuming his slog towards the main campus from Heights Alliance, grumbling his way towards the classroom and towards his first lessons of the day. After all, it wasn't rational that one should rely so heavily on Murphy's Law and the need for caffeine and consistency. It wasn't rational. It wasn't logical. It hardly made any sense to think that doing things the same way and having a med cup of coffee not fall to the ground could prevent something bad from happening, or that if it did fall something bad would happen. It was a waste of time and, frankly, one of the more absurd notions that he'd ever considered even entertaining, let alone being wary of. He was stupid for thinking it, let alone let it bother him. Of course, he knew why he always turned a sour thought towards the supposed Murphy and his irksome presence. He knew exactly who had set that thought in his head, their own grumblings echoing his own as he tucked his hands into his pockets and turned his nose into his capture weapon, eyes scanning the bobbing umbrellas that surrounded him. Murphy was always in but. Still, he'd always scoffed at Hizashi and Oboro whenever they complained about the inconveniences brought on by this spectral being and his law for chaos, as invisible as it was and illogical as it always seemed. An eye roll would follow after that scoff and a less than subtle reminder that one made their own luck and that anything bad that happened was the result of happenstance or one's own doing. Not some hypothetical Murphy. No one could convince him otherwise. I'm right behind you, Sho. It had been raining that day too. And he'd assumed things that day too. Like the FNG idiot he always was. That assumption was mistake number 2. Assuming that he made his own med luck. And really it was an assumption he knew he never should have made given his history and the prevalence of his thoughts continually returning to that idea of anything that can go wrong probably will. Sometimes that adage proved true despite one's best efforts. Sometimes bad things happen through no fault of one's own, and they continued to happen no matter what one tried. What a frustration. What an irrationality. What a FING problem. And Shoyuta was never one for irrational thinking if he could help it. Practicality, careful thinking, understanding the facts of the situation. That's where he lived. Except for those few times. But those were exceptions, not the norm, and certainly not frequent enough to be considered a law. Right? A fat raindrop slipped between the folds of Shuta's capture weapon and worked down his shirt again, slipping just between the man's shoulder blades, making the underground hero growl in annoyance. He couldn't reach the Demed thing, and it was getting more than a drizzle now to be called, such that it was really starting to piss him off as he tightened the pressure that kept his bag with his papers and lessons neatly tucked beneath his arm. The man sniffed lowly and straightened, only stopping for a brief moment to consider that he ought to, perhaps, heed that bell chime that was warning in the back of his thoughts. That sound that sang and tinged and echoed, because it had never seemed to steer him wrong before. Annoying as it was. But it's an irrational superstition. And as it was, there wasn't any real indication that things would go sour, that things would be any different than they always were. Mistake number 3. Of course it was. And, in hindsight, he should have remained mindful to quashing his own ire in favor of paying attention to his surroundings and the people that moved around him, who spoke and laughed and chattered nearby. Because had he done so, then he would have noticed the chalky pallor and flushed cheeks of the resident problem child a hell of a lot sooner than he did as the boy nearly stumbled past him. In truth, had Shoyuta not been so dismissive of the thoughts of trying to reject the initial Murphy Law warning in his head, and the all-too-familiar pressure it brought to his chest, the memories it conjured, the thoughts it reminded him of, he would have noticed a lot more than just that a lot sooner. He would have taken in the sleep-deprived gaze, the bags that hung beneath a wearied expression, and the slack mouth that forced itself into a smile when someone deemed it appropriate to pay the boy any attention as he lifted his head to peek up from his book. And he would have acted sooner, remedied the issue faster than he had. He would have been better. As it was, though, Shoyuta was a moron, incredibly obtuse and stuck in his thoughts. And Izuku Midoriya was impressively adept at not drawing attention to himself when he didn't wish to, and, consequently, had flown under Shuta's radar until far too late into the day and week. His success at doing so was only furthered by the underground hero's own irrational attitude that morning. That was a failing on Shuta's part. Failing number 4. Assumption number 4. Assuming he'd been all right to neglect to pay attention. That things were as they ought to be. Stealth hero indeed. But there was nothing for it. So caught up in keeping tally of the number of times Kaminari spoke out of turn and mentally preparing himself for the day ahead, priorities shifted and tilted in a direction they ought not to have. Rather than addressing the clues he'd picked up on, the little bits of information that he'd gleaned just by looking at the boy, the underground hero instead filed things away in order to ponder them later. Shoyuta was an idiot. It was cold and Izuku? Well, he was decidedly not feeling himself. He could admit to that much, though he was hesitant to admit to much else. Mostly because there wasn't much else to admit to, and he would lie through his teeth if he had to in order to make himself believe what he was saying. It had taken several days to even own up to this much of a sense of defeat in conceding that he wasn't feeling off, and slightly different than the norm. Not that it did much good. And not that he could do much about it. It had started a few days prior when he'd felt just a bit more tired, his movements sluggish, his eyes drooping at the slightest hint of being overworked and overused. Initially, the kid had brushed it off as nothing more than being exhausted from studying too hard and simply needing a break. That thought made sense since they were in the middle of testing. Not to mention that he'd been training extra hours with all might to gain more control of One for All, pushing himself to master more of its power and practice his new attack styles. He couldn't always rely on massive smashes unless he wanted to lose use of his arms. Which he didn't. He really didn't. So training was a must, a necessity that sapped the boy of energy and resolve. In the last few weeks, he'd pushed himself through those practices, demanding and expecting more of his movements and resistance to the backlash of the power with each training exercise. He had to get better. He was already so far behind. He could push his limits. He could push further. He could prove that he was worth it. Except sometimes, maybe, he pushed a little too far? Or you're a little too weak, which is more likely. That's usually how it is. That's how it's always been. The familiar voice was there. The familiar criticism. The familiar chastisement. Perhaps he was weak. Perhaps he was always too weak. Complaining too much. Always complaining. But of course that wasn't the only problem that had piled up and threatened to overwhelm if Izuku focused on the details too long, which he wasn't keen to do as it gave him a headache. Overwhelmed because you can't keep up. He was working through daily runs with Ida, and helping to tutor Mina and Kaminari, who'd asked for help in preparation for the next round of testing, though why they asked him of all people was a mystery. Not one to like to refuse a chance to help those he admired, he'd instantly agreed and spent several after-school hours with Yaoyorozu making lesson plans and study guides that they made copies of for the entire of Class 1A, while also offering to give his analysis notebook over for them to study. Only after he'd done that and gone for his afternoon training with all might did he finally have time to work on his own assignments, which seemed to be growing in intensity because testing was coming up. And he felt like he was falling behind there. So he'd spent more time trying to get that done, fear of failing his courses driving him to excel, pushing him to complete his assignments. He had to be better, do better. He was already at a disadvantage. He couldn't afford to fall further behind. Unfortunately, Izuku ended up missing a few meals because he'd been so tired trying to cram in the time to just get the word in, with reviewing notes and writing essays for his own work, to the point that, more than once, he jerked awake at his desk at 4 in the morning, heart hammering in his chest because he'd dozed off and fallen into. Well, he didn't want to think about that either. That was just another issue. One that he was trying to avoid, one he didn't have time for. Come now, little brother. You're the only family I have. You're never going to be a hero. A spark of green along his fingertips ignited, as his quirk protested that was locked in the recesses of the dreams he tried to forego, the memory and image of all for one jeering down at the first wielder, and at him in turn, almost like he could see Izuku, hear him understand that he was there too. It left Izuku panting, short of breath, his chest burning, eyes stinging, as ripples of energy rolled off of him, voices humming in his ears and through his head, making light and sound and movement difficult to stand. It didn't seem one he or the rest of the vestiges wanted to dwell on. The boy hastily shoved those figures and phantoms back, shoved the familiarity of that voice down, away from the forefront of his mind, and tried to avoid letting himself fall into that stupor of thought and dreaming. No, those dreams? They didn't matter compared to everything else he had to worry about. And he was fine. Really. All things considered. He had that off feeling. But he could deal with it. He could handle this. It wasn't so bad, just a regular day as a hero student. That's what he needed to keep telling himself. Regardless. There were a lot of demands on his plate, a lot of things to take care of, but if he cared enough about it, he'd figure it out. He'd push through it and make it all work. Because that's what heroes did. They solved the problems. They saved others. They didn't fall behind and complain. And soon enough, Izuku tried to remind himself, he'd get more sleep and start to feel like everything made sense again. Soon enough everything would settle down. Everything would go back to normal and he'd get through this testing PRD and the stress. Just like everyone else would. This was all normal, he was sure of it. It had to be. It's just what you have to go through, he chided lightly as he'd made his way out the door of his dorm room, not sparing a glance in the mirror, refusing to see the paleness of his cheeks. They weren't as bad as they were yesterday. Or, they'd not been any worse off than they were the day before, perhaps. No, but to truly excel he had to expect this to be difficult, right? Everyone else was doing just fine with the same rigors and expectations, flourishing in developing their powers and technique. Why not him then? He could do the same. He had to do the same. So, true to his nature, his habits and his penchant for being determined to prove himself and everyone else wrong, Izuku ignored the problems. He simply pretended that things weren't what he worried they might be, wrote off the bothers that afflicted his senses, the muddled head, the ringing ears, the stiff joints, and he carried on with a grin, even if it was a little forced at times. Because that's what you did as a hero. You grinned. You bore it. And you moved forward. Not that anyone noticed or chose to point out anything if they did. Not that Izuku could fault them either. It's not like he was trying to admit that he felt poorly, which he didn't. He understood that things were hectic. It was, admittedly, a busy time, and everyone seemed consumed with bettering themselves and preparing for their second semester rather than taking notice of one another. Not that Izuku could fault them for that or find himself too upset by the oversight. He hadn't wanted to be noticed anyway, so it was good that no one chose to peer too closely or ask too many questions of the wielder of One for All. All the better for him that he could keep things to himself and not let it slip that he was falling behind and breaking down. Screwing up. Though Izuku wasn't sure if he should feel comforted by all of this or not, no matter how much he didn't want to be a bother to anyone. Part of him was grateful, sure, that he could keep things secret, not stand out from the rest. It meant that he was doing a good job of protecting All Might's quirk, keeping a promise that he still felt unworthy and undeserving to even hold. There would always be that part of him that maybe still hoped for something more. Someone to care, not out of obligation but from genuine compassion. But it was a conflicted feeling. Selfish. You're so dead selfish. Maybe he was. Yeah. Maybe that was true. Expecting others to put him first? To care about him that way? When he'd done what for them? Nothing. He'd done nothing to deserve that type of care. And that wasn't fair to them, and it spoke of a childishness in Izuku that he ought to have sidelined a long time ago. But he was always so sensitive like that. Such a crybaby, that voice sneered in his ear. Still, regardless of what he tried and how much he put into ignoring them, the annoyances and feeling off seemed to persist. His denial, however strong it was, wasn't good enough. Some of his problems even appeared to get worse, which was mildly frustrating. And more Izuku felt increasingly off and not himself. But there was nothing for it. He denied and it continued. And he pretended and it increased. Damn it all. Despite his best efforts, the roughness in the back of his throat grew more pronounced, making it difficult to swallow. The headache that had started dull, like a knot at the base of his skull, amplified whenever the boy turned his head the wrong way or he stepped into the sunlight or turned on his lamp. The aches in Izuku's joints and muscles never seemed to get better, never seemed to ease up, despite his best efforts to spend more time stretching or drink more tea. He felt too stiff, too sore, too cold. A chill seemed to shroud him, wrapping him in a frigid embrace he couldn't seem to escape no matter the thickness of his hoodie or jacket or scarf to fight off the autumn breeze. And, admittedly, more than once the kid wanted to forget going on his morning run and simply sleep, staying warm, letting the knots in his joints and muscles stay wrapped in his blankets. He wanted to forget staying awake, his eyes burning, too strained to see straight sometimes. Sleep was lacking, his body craving it, aching, wearied mind begging for rest. But Izuku knew that he couldn't just rest. He could sleep. He couldn't sit back and give in to that feeling. It was a stupid thing to consider. He had to keep pushing himself more than anyone else because doubt lingered. Rightfully so. You're not a worthy successor. Izuku knew he had miles to go to reach his peers' levels and abilities. He couldn't waste his time lounging in bed. It wouldn't do any good. What good are you if you're not fighting for something? He wasn't worth anything if he was just sitting here, doing nothing. He wasn't go for anything if he'd let himself fall behind. He had to fight. He had to live up to All Might's ideals and be something more than he was. He had to prove he deserved this power, this responsibility, this mantle. So, each day, he'd get up somewhat begrudgingly and trudge out to go through his paces, jogging through the early morning hours, when the sun was barely peeking over the horizon and few faces were out and about. He'd run, even if he felt a little slower, his head a little heavy, sleep tugging at his eyes. He'd run. And he'd keep running, damn it. If you can't push through this, how can you push through the rigors of being a hero? He had to be stronger. He needed to be. Thankfully, the cool air would bring him a small jolt back to awareness, and about halfway through Izuku would feel this weird split between invigoration and exhaustion. His thoughts would be firing at rapid pace, even as his muscles ached from overuse and far too little sleep. Warmth and cold. Awake and exhausted. Alert and distractible. Push through it, Izuku. Be better than that. So, push through he would. Because if All Might, even after his body had been weakened and he was only able to use embers of one for all, could continue to run and fight and get up each day, not quite feeling his best, then so could Izuku. Izuku was whole. Izuku was young. Izuku didn't have injuries like All Might. He had no excuse. Izuku had nothing to hold him back except his own failures. Of course, the same mentality followed after his homework as well. If others could do it, so could he. He didn't need to give up just because he was tired. He needed to be better than that. where he could forego one small assignment in favor of going to bed earlier, Izuku adamantly refused, slogging through mathematical equations and poetic nuance, staying up late into the night to finish up and fine-tune his assignments. Because it mattered. I don't just want to go to UA. I want to excel. He had to excel. The symbol of peace needed him to excel. He had something more important on the line than just an assignment. He had to prove to himself that he could do this. That he was the right choice. That All Might could trust him. That they all could. Because All for One was a terrifying villain. After the fight at Kamino, Izuku learned just how little he could control One for All, how much more he had to give in order to be able to stand as tall as All Might did. Especially against a villain that evoked a sense of never-ending dread with their mere presence. One that had left him feeling sick and sweating and fearing for his life without ever even speaking to him directly. A villain that was still, very much, alive. A villain that Izuku would have to face one day, no doubt because he wanted the power that Izuku had. And he'd do whatever he could to get it. And Izuku had to be ready. He couldn't forget it. He couldn't just sit there and do nothing. No villain ever truly dies. Their memory, motives, powers, influence live on in some form. Izuku could see that in Shigaraki, and he knew that sooner, rather than later, he'd have to face the decay Quirker again. This time though, it'd probably be as it was for All Might and All for One. An all-out war, one against the other, two powers and two successors battling against each other and for their predecessors. Izuku couldn't simply joke and laugh his way through school. He had to do more, train harder, be better. Push his limits. So he put in extra effort and attention in all his studies, when he could spare it, especially in his combat skills training, which was an area that he particularly wanted to excel in. Mercifully, being in school afforded him the opportunity to train with many different quirks and techniques. The way Izuku saw it was that this was probably the best way to get experience without completely endangering himself. Or cause problems. If he got a few bloodied lips or broken bones in the process, well, those were minor issues. Still too, this type of training helped for the upcoming team trials, where they'd be graded on their ability to work together, and, given the issue with the last test he went through, the would-be hero was keen to do markedly better. He didn't want to add fuel to the fire where Aizawa-sensei's ire was concerned. A place where he'd still needed to improve over all others. A place where he'd failed too many times and let his sensei down on more than one occasion. He needed to prove to his sensei that he deserved to be here, that he wasn't going to make the same mistakes he had before. In this he was behind. He was trying to catch up. He was trying to repent for his mistakes. He was trying to show he was better. That he could be trusted. You haven't earned my trust yet, Midoriya. He'd failed. Those words haunted. The look that had been in the man's face haunted. The guilt that Izuku felt because he'd let his sensei down? That ached with such an intensity that it left the boy reeling from it all. A raw determination fueling him forward despite the doubt that continued to linger like a shadow with each strike through and lap around the school perimeter. The boy hated disappointing others, especially those he admired, so it was a sound blow when his sensei had admitted to the boy what his shortcomings were, that he'd not done enough to convince his teacher that he was worth the effort, that he could be a hero, that he could help others. You're nothing but a liability in battle. Izuku didn't have full control of his quirk, didn't have the same level of understanding of his power that others had of theirs. He was behind, lagging, lacking, and struggling to keep up. Each day he felt slower, even if he was gaining control, learning to use his powers in new ways. It never felt like it was enough. He never felt like he was enough. Those thoughts stung as much as any look of disapproval he'd received from his sensei, as any look of worry from his mother, from All Might. But when they were combined together, the look and the words, it cut deeply and picked at the thin layer of self-assurance the boy held for himself. But each day that resolve seemed thinner and he felt more and more exposed, made aware of his ineptitude and failures, his unworthiness, and his stupidity for thinking that maybe someone might see him as deserving of kindness like that. That they might think he was good enough now. That he'd earned it. But Izuku had thrown it away. Disappointed and screwed things up and destroyed that relationship. And he was left scrambling with the sense that he wasn't on sure footing. That there wasn't anyone there who truly felt him capable of being a hero, including himself. But Izuku had never been one to sit idly by and wallow. That'd just make me more pathetic, he reminded as he trudged through the rain and into the hall, keeping his head tucked low, thoughts and focus turned inward as his feet followed a familiar path that his brain didn't need to stay focused on. Around him the world pitched and chattered. Colors and shapes blended together as the boy blinked a few times, straining to stay steady, turning his focus from wallowing into action and something productive. Something meaningful. Like getting more training in, getting more homework done, and getting to class on time. It had driven him this far, pushed him to want to be better, do better, become something. Become someone who could save everyone, including himself perhaps. And right now, at school, it was imperative that he do well because this was a monumentally important team simulation they were fighting. And he had helped train for this day for weeks now. Not just for himself. This wasn't just about him fighting to succeed, he reminded as he eased in the classroom and slid into his seat, catching the snippets of conversation that sailed around him. The world felt stuffy and overly warm now as water dribbled down his curls and neck. It was about more. People he cared about, friends who needed to succeed as much as he did, each of them fighting for their own palace in hero society. Each of them fighting for their status for one reason or another. Purpose. Desire. And, damn it all, it was why he wanted it to go well. All right, class. This was why he ignored the way his head spun and his vision dimmed at the edges when he stood. His fingers caught the edge of his desk carefully, as he focused on breathing, straining to listen to his teacher speak, remembering trying to understand what was happening. Thankfully, it didn't take much to jog his memory as Aizawa-sensei's voice carried through dimness of his vision, searing like a jolt to his senses. It's time for the team training battles, the man's low voice reverberated, as Izuku lifted his head carefully, blurred colors shifting into a semi-solid sloshed image of his sensei. He blinked again and the world settled briefly, calming, as Izuku trained on the man's words, and on his own growing excitement. They'd be heading down to the training facility to prepare for the first matches of the team training. You already know that we'll be doing rigorous training, so I expect you to pay attention when you get out to the field. He bit back a wince as his ears rang with a painful chime, his throat scratchy and raw. He didn't miss the hard look in Aizawa-sensei's gaze, the pointed frown, the narrowed eyes. The judgment. Their teacher was on the warpath today and seemed less inclined than normal to put up with the chatter Izuku's class usually exuded. This was why no one dared say much more than "Sensei," eyes locked on their teacher, a tense, bated breath waiting to exhale. Kaminari, Ashido, and Kirishima were more than a little subdued, and Izuku admitted to missing their voices as the heavy silence lingered. It reminded him too much of other classes, and other students whose quirks were also impressive but whose attitudes and friendliness were somewhat neglected. He had been. And perhaps all of this was more motivation for Izuku not to get on his sensei's bad side today as well by admitting to weakness. He didn't need another reason for the man to want to expel him. He didn't need another reason to receive that look, the one that left him questioning his status as a would-be hero, as a member of One, that look that made him both want to smile and cringe because he just couldn't tell what his teacher was thinking and he worried it bordered on the displeased. Izuku hated the not knowing. The hopefulness he sometimes felt when Aizawa-sensei praised him was always tempered by the familiarity of that look. That same look he'd received from his other teachers. That same look he mistrusted. Which was why he pretended like his vision wasn't blurring again, the world going dimmer and his steps feeling like jello with each foot forward he took down the hall, heading towards the changing room to get into his uniform. He waved away his friends' insistence that he hurry and their chastisement for his sluggishness as they turned back down the hall towards him, the light leading outdoors streaming around their silhouettes, making his head pound. Izuku hastily adjusted his shoe, having forgotten to tie it in his slower-paced rush to change. "You're usually the first one there. Are you nervous?" Emerald eyes widened slightly. Nervous? Did he seem nervous? "You do seem a bit hesitant. I'm sure there's nothing to worry about, Midoriya." Izuku flushed, embarrassed, his ears ringing painfully, trying to downplay the weariness that tugged at emotions and strength, threatening to drag him down. Oh no, I'm fine. Just stop considering the potential scenarios we might be going through. He plastered a smile on his face as Ida's face blurred before him, hastily working to adjust his arm guards and gloves, quickly tying his red sneakers in firm knots, swallowing back the nausea that threatened to spill from his lips as his knees shook when he tried to stand. The world swayed. He was fine. You sure that's all, Deku? Uraraka narrowed her gaze thoughtfully, frowning through her visor. You're not worried you'll have to fight Baku? I'm fine. Really? He laughed, quickly, trying to quash the thought that had nearly escaped his friend's lips, well aware of the sharp, crimson eyes that had snapped towards the pair. Best to downplay the situation. I just don't want to miss anything. Izuku maneuvered ahead of the pair, pushing off his friend's hovering as he adjusted the belt of his costume, ignoring the way his fingers trembled and colors blended into sea waves that did nothing to help the way his stomach twisted and gurgled. Trying to recall a few last-minute notes I wanted to write down before I forget them. He was fine. And he hadn't been lying to his friends mostly did either, as he pulled out his notebook, waving it lightly at his friends with a smile, before he started jotting down a few sentences, his scribbled notations scrawling and slanted and far messier than normal. Idly, he spied Vlad King and Eza-sensei both slowly make their way towards the center of the pavilion where they waited in silence that stretched from the students to their position ahead, a tense atmosphere beginning to settle on the wary first years as they considered the expressions of their homeroom instructors. And Izuku was eager to take in every detail, theories beginning to percolate. It was a good distraction, helped him to focus on what was more important. Because with the appearance of Vlad King, and the way his students were marching towards Izuku's class, this meant that Class 1B was likely involved. Of course they're involved, you idiot. Izuku winced and shook his head as he scratched his pen against paper. So, a competition then? Which meant that the teams would be interesting. Would they combine us into teams with people from each homeroom combined by quirk combinations? Or split by class? Kendo and Kirishima could be a good duo, or they could be good opponents. That makes for an interesting interaction. He could do this, he knew, as long as he stayed alert and focused on the important things. Like analysis. It would all be fine if he could do that, do what he always did, even if the world dimmed again and a trickle of sweat slipped from his temple and curled into his hair and his hands continued to shake. Izuku gripped his pen tighter and strained to listen to his teacher talk about how this would be a team trial between classes. It's time to assess your training and see what you've really learned, Vlad's voice carried as he near glowered at 1A. Competitive? So a face-off between 1A and 1B then. How will they choose teams? And judging by the jeering grin on Monoma's face, and the way it was zeroed in on him, a few comments meant prickle at his pride. Izuku knew that there would be trouble brewing, though he didn't fully understand the why behind it. Still, it seemed that the other boy had a decided motivation for wanting to beat 1A and Izuku in particular. It's time to see if you're as golden as they say, the copy quirker laughed loudly, his fingers twitching with an animated glee that highlighted his eagerness for this matchup and battle. But for Izuku it was utter confusion. Had the other boy made it known that Bakugo or Todoroki, or Yaoyorozu or Ito were his target, it'd make more sense. They were the top students in the class after all. But for some reason, Monoma seemed hell-bent on asserting he was better than Izuku. But why? Why would he even care about beating me? It's not like Izuku was ever a threat to Monoma to begin with. He'd never provoked the other, never tried to say he was any better or worse at something than the copy quirk holder, which was a stark contrast to how Bakugo had reacted to the blonde 1B classmate during the sports festival. Not that Izuku blamed Bakugo for that reaction either. Monoma had been tactically aggressive in his attention to Bakugo during the cavalry battle, something he came to regret later on, thanks to the explosion quirk holder's penchant for holding a grudge. It seemed the two of them were a lot alike in that regard. Still, logically, it made more sense that Monoma would want to continue that rivalry instead of starting a new, far less exciting, one with Izuku. So why was he staring down the emerald-eyed boy so intensely? We also have another student joining us for this exercise. Izuku blinked, his pen nearly falling from his grip as he came back to the reality that his teacher had, in fact, been speaking and He'd missed more than half of it in his quest to understand just what he'd done to provoke Monoma's ire. Bad form Izuku. He's a Gen Ed student hoping to transfer into the hero course. Gen Ed? Izuku perked at those words, squinting towards his sensei as the underground hero rumbled on evenly, the tenseness around his eyes still there, though his shoulders and stance seemed a little more at ease. So, this wasn't an unexpected development. The boy cleared his throat quietly, his pen renewed in its sweep over the page as he notated the shift in conversation and the eager murmur that reverberated around him. Team battles. That's so exciting. Who do you think will be teamed with? I wonder how big the teams will be? It seems likely they'd be going for even teams, given the size of our classes. Except what about the other student? A bead of sweat slipped from his temple as Izuku chewed on his bottom lip, considering the stream of conversation around him. They were going to be split against one another, Class 1A against 1B. Groups of 4 judging by the size of their classes and the number of rounds they'd have to get through. But there will need 2 groups of 5 to account for the additional student. 1 round on each side to keep it even, which would be an advantage for the team with the extra member. Izuku frowned as he sped through his thoughts, trying to figure out why the teachers would deliberately make uneven teams and strategize a solution to the problem that could produce. Depending on what the team lineups were, it would do well to have a few options available, especially if your team is on the disadvantage. Unless it was the disadvantage to have that extra member? But then that brings it back to why they'd ask this student to join in the first place. Not just for show, right? There has to be more to it than that, especially for the student. The boy hummed softly to himself, turning to a new, unblemished page, hands trembling as pen returned to paper. Izuku blinked a few times to clear his vision. And if it's a Gen Ed student? There weren't many Gen Ed students who were vying for a place in the hero course. At least, not many that Izuku knew of. It would have been common knowledge had more than 2 or more students had a keen interest in such a transfer, which helped to narrow things a bit. Izuku scoured his memory as the conversation swelled around him, calls of excitement, hushed as they were, echoing in his ears, making the boy bite back a wince as picked through his memory. Since he'd started at UA, there were a few students he'd come to know well in the Gen Ed course, his curiosity always pushing him to chat with new people even if those interactions usually ended rather dismally. Though not always. You can't help what you long for. Green eyes widened at the realization. A smile split across the boy's face as he recalled a sparring match at the sports festival, and the only Gen Ed student to make it to the second round. And it's been a DMN good match too. This is my chance. 2 rounds will have our extra student joining in order to give them a fair chance to represent both Class 1A and 1B. Trying to find the right fit perhaps? Of where he could go. Which class would be best for him? That did make sense. This could be the right time to test him. Trying to find where the quirk could best be utilized, strengthened, and trained alongside those who would and could help develop the power into something greater. Izuku snapped his book shut, eyes shining brightly as he scanned the mock cityscape, sear chin as anticipation and an almost eager excitement filled him, warring against the ache, staving off the chill that burrowed in his bones. Fingers trembled and he nearly dropped his book as a tingle trembled through him, the fabric of his costume breathable but still susceptible to the late autumn chill. Of course. Of course. He wanted to smack himself for not considering sooner. But, then again, Izuku was kind of an idiot. He wanted to believe he was smart, but it was moments like this where he realized that he wasn't. The boy peered around, straining to see, squinting into the light, shifting his gaze around to look. And there he was. There, coming out of the far corner doorway that led into the main building, Izuku spied a familiar mop of lavender hair, deep shadows beneath tired eyes, and a trademark unimpressed frown. With an oddly similar capture weapon wound around blue-clad shoulders, and a mask sitting idly couched amongst the gray material, the brainwashing quirk wielder slowly moved to stand between Vlad King and Aizawa-sensei. And now Izuku understood better what was going on and the importance of the situation. Which sort of made it all the more important for Izuku to do well, to perform well, to follow the rules and be a better example of what a hero student was and ought to be. He needed to excel. These team trials were meant to test your ability to work with others, melding your powers together, working to solve problems and save innocent lives. And now with Shinso no less. And that pounding at his temples? The dizziness and nausea? It made more sense now. It was nerves. Jitters. He was just nervous because of what this exercise meant. To him and Uraraka and most of the other participants, it was just another training, just another scenario to work through. Sure, it was important, an excellent way to test their growth as would-be heroes and to gauge their capabilities in dealing with difficult and strong opponents. But mostly it wouldn't affect them to the point of expulsion. Hopefully. That was par for the hero course, a staple of the curriculum. Class 1A was used to it. But to Shinso, it was. Izuku could feel a weight settle on his chest, its pressure and presence a stark reminder of what was at stake now. From where he stood and observed, this was Shinsu's chance. A trill of excitement filled Izuku's chest. Because this was perfect for the other boy. This was a test, a stepping stone towards the hero course and towards a new class and new potential future. And though they'd only sparred one other time during the sports festival, Shinsu's admission, spoken for only Izuku to hear, had been enough to remind the emerald-eyed boy that everyone here at UA longed for something. Not just Izuku. He'd be selfish to really think otherwise. At the same time, however, Shinso and Izuku were somewhat different than the rest. Yes, everyone longed for something, or they wouldn't be at this school. But some had more cause than others to seek that validation that they'd never had growing up. Like he and the brainwashing quirk holder. If Izuku's theory was right, then he understood Shinsu's motivations on an entirely different level than the others since both of them had been marginalized by their peers. The green-haired boy certainly knew the rumors that swirled through the classes about Shinsu's brainwashing quirk. Hell, he'd experienced the very thing during the festival. And yet, he knew that it must have been a lonely childhood for the kid. If these rumors swirled now, imagine what it was like when he was just a child? I'm not here to make friends. I am here to prove I can make it into the hero course though. Shinsu's words were subdued but impactful, deliberate in their acerbic nature as he assessed his opponents, both classes standing as opposition to the Gen Ed student. He sees himself as an outsider. The thought didn't sit well with Izuku as much as the rumors never had, and the boy felt the urge to do something about the spark of hesitation he saw in the other's face as he tucked his notebook away and adjusted his gloves. His thoughts were jumbled, determined, but jumbled as he assessed the possibilities available to him. Perhaps he could talk to Shinso? Perhaps he ought to focus on the fight? Another trickle of sweat slipped slowly down the boy's spine as he tried to prevent his hands from shaking, ignoring the way his joints ached and shuddered being used. Why would he see himself as an outsider? He's got such a powerful quirk. Powerful and dangerous. Amaranthine eyes landed on Izuku, a challenge sparking in the taller boy's face as he seemed to acknowledge the one person who had bested him out of the entire group of first-year hero students. The one person Shinso had vowed to fight again, and defeat stayed locked in his gaze, scrutinized and judged. This, of course, made Izuku swallowed back the surprise, schooling his face to hide the wince as his burning, scratching throat protested. People can't help what they long for. Seems like you're popular today, Deku. Uraraka's voice tickled his ear and Izuku could do nothing but nod as he watched the first teams make their way towards their respective team locales, Shinso working with one as first grouping, listening intently and silently, to Kaminari's chattering as they moved further from the spectators, Izuku included. He'd be facing Shinso later. A rematch he was both excited for and dreading. A wave of adrenaline, eagerness, and concern sprang to life within him, and he returned to his notebook, thoughts whirring as he observed the first matchups, teams at their ready, eagerly waiting for the signal to start. This would get interesting. Initially, when the first teams began their tests, the signal blaring for their game of cat and mouse to start, Shoyuta reveled in taking copious notes of each of the team's inner workings, in particular their stratagems and communication, or lack thereof. This move was intentional given that all of these had been criticisms he'd had during their last exams against the teachers. It made sense that he'd want to give those a second look now, if for no other reason than to gauge how far these kids had come in such a short time. And given the nature of his morning commute to class, with the shards of his mug carefully set on his desk for remedy later on that evening, Shoyuta was, admittedly, far keener to draw out his criticisms, detailing the most minute of details. Short-tempered is what Hizashi called him when he was like this, when the thought of his chattering class brought a twitch to his eye. Shoyuta preferred the term pragmatic. Practical and efficient even. Why waste unnecessary time with unnecessary questions and gossiping? Especially when they had a great deal to cover with today's activities, the students' normal classes on hold for the morning in order to foster enough time to finish these team trials the hero course teachers had designed for their first-year children. So, pragmatic is what he needed to be. And for a few moments, he wondered if, perhaps, the shattering of his mug had been a motivator in getting him through the stressors of the day rather than hindering him as he had originally assumed. For, when Shoyuta was in a foul mood, he was far more focused on the task at hand and getting from point A to point B with as little fuss as possible. Fuss like idle chatter and overly excitable children. Agitation made for efficiency for the underground hero. So, if his glare was a bit more pronounced and if he was far more keen to pick apart each of his students' capabilities, it was all the better, he supposed. Especially when they were facing off against Class 1B and the overly competitive Vlad King. But Sekijiro-kun wasn't merely being a good sport about this. Mimicking his student, Monoma, Kin displayed an eagerness to defeat 1A and its more powerful quirk holders. Shoyuta thought it a bit transparent on the other teacher's part. Yes, Ken was an excellent instructor, but sometimes he let his drive towards excellence cloud his judgment just a tad. It was somewhat bothersome, but also somewhat satisfying as he watched his students excel, for the most part, in their respective battles, each teammate working in tandem with one another, relaying information, utilizing their quirks in unique and efficient ways that managed to outwit and outmaneuver their opponents. Still, the underground hero could see the need for improvement. A few students left themselves wide open, while others remained far too focused on other opponents that they missed the obvious dangers right in front of them. Some teams seemed a bit hesitant to execute stratagems, unwilling to overstep that invisible barrier and boundary of insecurity that they'd constructed for themselves. It slowed their paces, made their moves clumsy and delayed, and severely limited their stealth when it came to surprising the opponents. Still others seemed unwilling to step into a leadership role at all, far more content to move responsibility onto someone else, weakening their bonds of communication and reliability through their resistance. Clearly, Shoyuta would have to work on building confidence in their critical thinking. Just as there were no countdowns in real battles, there was no room for hesitation. Heroes couldn't afford to stay lax on developing offensive, defensive, and rescue strategies. Too many lives were on the line. They'd have to learn to take on a variety of roles, perform a variety of jobs. Sometimes they'd be the leader, and sometimes they'd have to learn to follow. And while the agitation from the morning poured into his pen and onto his paper, his assessments detailed and precise, though not unkind, he couldn't help the uptick of curiosity and anticipation for the next team match. He'd seen the way Monoma and Shinso had both targeted Midoriya, their obvious rivalry with Problem Child ensuring that this would be a tense, if entertaining battle. Dark eyes swept over the three students individually, watching with a somewhat dour expression as the groups dispersed, heading towards their respective safety points before the match would begin. Interestingly, Monoma and Shinso seemed to be conversing lowly, the blonde gesturing softly as the other three members of their team huddled nearby. The group of five walked, somewhat awkwardly, away from the spectators. But it was One's team that had Shoyuta tensing ever so slightly when he turned towards his students. Or, rather, it was the one Problem Child that held the underground hero's attention. Though the boy remained attentive to what his teammates were saying, Shoyuta could see that the pallor of his skin seemed less vibrant, stance far more hesitant, hunched, and unsteady. The man frowned, a bell chiming in the back of his mind, a familiar signal that, perhaps, something was wrong. You should call off the match. You should call off the match. Something begged for him to make that move, to push that narrative to fruition and end this battle before it began, as he watched Midoriya stumble a fraction of a second before righting himself and letting his quirk flare to life. Toxic green lightning swirled and crackled, as a grin split the boy's face, his raw determination shining through the pale shade his skin had taken, as he nodded to his teammates. Shoyuta should stop the match. The timer signaled to start. Izuku Midoriya took off, his teammates close behind. The air seemed to ripple with power from their combined energies, but it was the frantic strikes of verdant lightning that held Shoyuta riveted and worried. Shuta's fingers twitched as the warning bell chimed again in his ear, as he stood back and hesitated. Waited. And made that next mistake of not stopping anything. Mistake number 5. Izuku swallowed back the roughness in his throat and blinked a few times to steady himself as his vision flickered and spots danced. He was walking on jello, a bounce and wobble with each step as his heart beat rapidly against his chest, a roaring filling his ears. It was just nerves. He was fine. He always got like this before a big match, agitation and energy prickling at him until he could let loose. Liar! A voice hissed in his ear. Izuku cleared his throat again and straightened himself upright, squaring his shoulders and clenching his jaw as he glared at the door that had led to the rooftop 3 buildings away, nearby the area where they'd concluded the other team had congregated. Not a lie. Not a liar. Liar. The boy shook his head, earning a curious glance from Uraraka that he hastily waved off with a smile as he held a finger to his lips. They needed to stay silent. Keep their plan in motion. This was nerves. It was just nerves. And he really needed to pull himself together too. This was important. Izuku couldn't screw this up now because of some stupid hesitation on his part. Though, stepping carefully across the rooftop, moving further into the mock cityscape, doubt started to creep in. Just for a moment he doubted, as the world dimmed and rippled and a blast of chilly autumn air cut through his costume, sending an ache down his spine. Just for a moment. Coward. The boy flexed his fingers and shook his head again, trying to steady himself. Izuku wasn't a coward. He could do this. He would do this. Swallowing back a cough, the boy waved his hand again, this time to gesture Uraraka and the others forward, and panning out to go wide. They needed to put their plan into action. Silent and steady. The world pitched sideways as Izuku launched forward, letting his quirk flare, and that power spark around him. Steady. In truth, Hitoshi had been excited for the rematch with Midoriya, though he'd never admitted out loud. And least of all to Midoriya himself. The kid was an overeager befriender and Shinso was not. Sometimes, Hitoshi often wondered if Izuku Midoriya had been the traitor at UA because of his almost incomparable aspirations and admiration for heroics and the bright example of the epitome of his field, All Might. In fact, the lavender-haired boy was a little too stubborn to confess to his eagerness for anything, especially not friendship, nor the idea of outwitting someone he secretly admired. Admired and loathed. No need to give Midoriya more cause to move towards him with that smile and overeager attempt to include him. Yes, he was, in fact, ready to set the bar even and win, and this matchup and opportunity was the perfect time to do that. Because he was far more prepared than he had been the last go-round. And because of that, Shinso was even more stubborn when it came to admitting his feelings. Fear? Excitement? He wasn't keen to express much at all. None of these were really emotions he let slip through that carefully crafted neutrality he bore, and being one who rarely showed any type of feeling, it would make for a pretty poor showing if he started doing so now. He certainly didn't want to. He figured it'd be a sign of weakness. And now, when the teams had been finalized and he was on the opposing side to the one who'd bested him in the sports festival. The golden quirk holder? It was a tantalizing prospect to be able to finally show the kid what he'd learned. To show them all. As he watched the other kid speed away, his quirk flashy and vibrant as ever, Shinso couldn't help but frown. Something was off about his opponent. And not just off, in the terms of Izuku Midoriya being a lively and bright-smiling overachiever, something Hitoshi would never understand or proclaim to wish to be. No, it was something else. Something that made Hitoshi pause to consider other oddities he'd initially chalked up to nerves on both sides. Shaking hands and legs. Unfocused gaze. The flushed cheeks. Something was definitely wrong with Izuku Midoriya. A flicker of worry ran through the boy as he watched sparks of green flare from a distance, brighter than they had been before, shots of lightning spidering outward and filling his view. almost erratic in their nature. Hitoshi narrowed his gaze, hands balling into fists as his teammates continued to talk, Monoma giving strict directions about how they'd ambush 1A and take down their offensive retriever, Midoriya. The chilly autumn breeze whistled through the metalwork and brushed through the boy's hair as the sun ducked behind a cloud, casting the buildings and opponents into shadows. We have to work fast. The brainwashing quirker nodded in agreement, his thoughts already turning towards his intended target and the urgency to capture Midoriya. If they could do that, then he was certain the others would topple. Hopefully. Still, it would be a lot harder than the Monoma kid was assuming, which was somewhat grating on Hitoshi's nerves. Because, if he'd learned anything, it was to never underestimate his opponents. Especially the seemingly innocent-looking ones. Izuku Midoriya was a prime example. But so too was Uravity. The girl's zero-gravity quirk had some distinct advantages that Hitoshi and even Monoma lacked, and the boy had noticed, while observing her match against Bakugo during the sports festival, that the girl was good at distracting when she wanted, never letting her true motives show until it was too late. And that was dangerous. Yet, his team seemed unfazed by the challenges before them. Monoma was, seemingly, declaring these opponents not worth his time, narrow-minded in his observations about what the others were capable of. Or at least that's what the other pretended to do. Hitoshi wasn't stupid. He could see what the copycat quirker was strategizing with and knew that if the blonde boy crowed loud enough about his dominance and his superiority that it might set their opposition at ease enough to be overtaken. A diversion. It was a simple but effective maneuver, used plenty of times in other instances and by other heroes, the amaranthan-haired boy knew, though Hitoshi doubted that it'd work the way Monoma wanted as he adjusted his voice modulator, eyes scanning the cityscape. They were up against Midoriya, a boy who had already analyzed Hitoshi's quirk and knew of Monoma's strategies. He wasn't likely to fall for the simple ploys that he'd tried before. Hell, it had been hard enough to convince the other boy to open his mouth the first time they'd fought. He knew that he'd never get Midoriya to speak now, even with a modulator to assist him. The green-haired boy was pretty clever and had, undoubtedly, figured out a way to bypass speaking to his teammates altogether in order to avoid Hitoshi's power to distract and disarm. It would be an uphill battle at best, he knew. He suspected that Monoma knew too, though was choosing the grating, overly self-assured route instead. Which was as admirable as it was aggravating. If we can get him alone and I can get close enough to him to touch him, then I can copy his quirk and that'll end it, Monoma snapped out in a bright whisper, his eyes nearly glittering in anticipation for his plan. The others are good but nowhere near the level Midoriya's at. We need to take him down first. It won't be so easy to do that, Hitoshi murmured quietly, scanning the buildings and metal piping that crisscrossed along the battleground. He'll know what you're planning. That kid seems to know everything. Monoma scoffed derisively as he moved away from the brainwashing quirk holder, blue-gray eyes trained on studying the other's face as he pursed his lips into a thin line, the air of mirth never abating as the boy leaned down and plucked a rock from the ground. Lanky fingers tossed the object idly in the air. I think you give him too much credit, you know. Hitoshi could hear the small twinge of annoyance in the other's tone, could see the way the pale blue eyes hardened at the mention that, perhaps, Izuku Midoriya was a formidable opponent to be wary of. He's just gotten lucky thanks to that impressive quirk of his and pandering to All Might. We just need to get at his good nature if we can. Annoy him into making a mistake. Amethyst eyes narrowed thoughtfully as he considered Monoma's claims and the obvious insecurity he seemed to feel about Midoriya's power and the supposed special treatment the boy received as a member of 1A. Kind of like you did. The boy's eye twitched as he thought about the truthfulness of the entire thing, and perhaps he and Monoma weren't so different than he originally assumed. Each of them was, after all, vying for success, trying to outshine someone who seemed to have everything given to them. The power, the good nature, the ability to appeal to those heroic inspirations that would ensure their success in the hero world. Maybe Monoma was just as jealous as someone like Hitoshi. Maybe they both had a score to settle with Midoriya. So, the boy let out a soft hum, his chest rumbling as thoughts swirled. I don't think he'll fall for something like that, he remarked evenly, trying to keep his face neutral. He's smart and that's already something that I did at the sports festival. It didn't last long. That fact still sort of set Hitoshi off. No one had ever broken from his brainwashing before. Ever. So, what made this kid so special? What was it about Izuku Midoriya that just broke things apart so easily? Why was he so damned talented and good at what he did? Why are you so jealous too? The boy blinked, fingers curling. Was he? Monoma leveled a bright gaze on Hitoshi, eyes flashing with an unreadable expression. He flicked the rock upwards again, grin never dipping. You don't seem to know how to really get under someone's skin then. The boy quirked his eyebrows upward briefly, smile widening. But I do. So, you just be ready to copy my voice and I'll get Midoriya to speak. We take him down, we take the others with him. The blaring of the horns signaled the start of the exercise and Hitoshi could do nothing but nod in agreement as the others in their group also deferred to Monoma as the unofficial leader of the exercise. They were meant to go covert while Hitoshi and Monoma acted as bait and distraction. Yet something didn't sit right with the boy about it all. There was something different about Monoma's words, something lurking there that the brainwashing quirker couldn't quite pinpoint, and it set him on edge. Not that he should be afraid of his own teammate, but part of him sort of worried for Midoriya. Even if he didn't know why. He could feel the wind as he rushed from one building to the next, even though his vision was a bit blurred around the edges, dimming to black if he didn't take in a deep enough breath. That was the key though, wasn't it? Izuku needed to remember to breathe. Still, the chilled air gave him just enough of a jolt to rock him back towards awareness, as he feverishly assessed the potential for an assault from either side of him. The probability of such an attack was high. Being alone held as many disadvantages as it did advantages. Yes, he could move quicker, not having to worry about his teammates beside him, drawing the attention of others with their larger grouping. But, at the same time, he also had to worry about others targeting him instead, which was also a high possibility, especially given the team dynamic Izuku had observed before the match had even begun. It was clear that this team had come prepared, had strategized and anticipated what Izuku and the others of the 1A team would do. How they might try to win. Of course, all of this was a speculation and a risk. But it wasn't without reward. It was a gamble that he and his teammates had agreed was a valuable one to make. They just had to play the game the right way. Be smart about all of this. They could do this. He could do this. Unless you're too weak. The boy squinted, his head giving a painful jolt that he promptly tried to quash in favor of focusing on the task at hand. The more important issues. He could take something for his headache later. But here and now? He had to keep his attention on what was before him and how he could capture Shinso and Monoma and the others without losing any of his own team. You have to lead. Deku, Mina and Ochako had admonished Izuku with encouraging smiles. You're the fastest and they won't know how to handle us sneaking up after you. Izuku suspected, and Ishido and Uraraka did, that the other team underestimated the usefulness of their respective quirks and powers. That would be one BS downfall if Izuku played his hand right and trusted his teammates to support him in the shadows. So, he'd kicked his power into drive, using just 15% of one for all to get his speed going, adrenaline driving Izuku forward, a giddy sort of eagerness fluttering in his stomach, warring with nausea as his brain mapped out the mock city, his gaze having locked onto Shinso only a few moments prior. The other boy hadn't moved from his perch 4 buildings over, standing like a beacon for Izuku to home in on and charge towards. Logically, he knew this was probably a trap. And logically, too, he knew that charging towards Shinso would be giving the others exactly what they wanted. Who else could be around here? He questioned silently, critical gaze searching the area, certain that there were others, and certain that they'd make themselves known soon. Everything was too orchestrated, too convenient. A layered approach. One stealthy distraction after another. He could sense something darker looming. Maybe it was a trap. That's not to say, though, that Izuku didn't have a trap of his own, one he and the others had come up with. They banked on the fact that Izuku had a better handle on one for all and could, reasonably, move faster than most of his opponents, if his analysis was anything reliable. It had helped to take down Monoma well enough, Uraraka's and Mina's timing and stealth paying off, their coordination and understanding of the other team's strengths and weaknesses a benefit too. He knew the other team's strengths and weaknesses probably as well as they knew his. It was a matter of outpacing the enemy at this point. And he could do that, he knew. He just needed the targets to present themselves. The boy blinked a few times as his feet touched down briefly atop the ledge of a rooftop before verdant lightning sparked around his ankles, and he took off once more, a tingling in his hands wrapping around his fingers as he watched Shinso narrow his eyes on Izuku, his obvious frown obscured by his voice modulator. Out in the open. He has to know our strategy. The idea that his team would work together through gestures instead of verbal cues had to be something that Shinso would have guessed, or so Izuku surmised. The boy's brainwashing quirk was only as strong as Shinso's ability to get someone to reply to his questions, and if Izuku and the others were going to do that, well, there was a moment of blistering pain as a large metal bar smacked against the side of Izuku's head, another striking him in the stomach, the whooshing of air burbling from his lungs as he pitched backwards, spots dancing across his vision as the gray-battled arena melded with the blues and whites of the sky overhead. Both moved with such a blinding speed that he hadn't had time to blink, let alone dodge. And damn it all, did it hurt. Sparks of green flared around the boy as he tried to steady himself, the force of the strike pushing him into a corner of brick and metal siding, his shoulder catching with a hard smack against the building. The boy grunted and tried to SCK in a lungful of air, crouching low, as his fingers curled around the injured shoulder. This has to be Reiko's quirk, he thought, anxiety and anticipation pumping wildly in his veins, his heartbeat loud in his ears. They're the only one. It's Glory Boy. Monoma's harsh bite echoed through the area, a laugh soon following as more debris cascaded around, seeking for Izuku and a chance to strike. I figured they'd send the retriever to sniff us out. Izuku grit his teeth as a piece of shrapnel caught the kid's cheek, drawing blood as Izuku tried to roll out of the way, a hard fist towards the oncoming shrapnel momentarily dispelling the onslaught of weaponry against Izuku. Verdant curls bounced as he whipped around and glared as he spied a flash of blonde. A metal rod caught him in the back, ricocheting off Izuku and exploding nearby, rocking the boy off balance as he scrambled to get out of the strike zone. Crimson trickled down his chin as he launched into the air, an icy glare following Izuku's every move, another barrage of metal bits sailing towards him. So, he's copied all of the others' quirks. Some people might balk from the question or try to play off their insecurities. But Shoyuta? Not so much. If anyone ever asked, he was never afraid to admit the truth. Shoyuta Aizawa had never considered himself to be good with handling children. It was also precisely for this reason that Shoyuta also never considered himself to be teacher material. The man simply didn't feel he had the patience for tackling the needs students would inevitably come to him for. Nor did he believe he had an aptitude for shaping young minds or molding the future. Generation of heroes, or whatever the hell that idealistic chatter was that so many spouted on about when they pandered and appealed to get new faces into classrooms. Something about the duty and honor found in education. Nope, that didn't appeal to the man. Shoyuta had never considered the prospect of being an instructor, never intended to be someone's sensei, and train others as would-be heroes. He'd never seen a reason to. Hell, why would he? He'd preferred to work alone, preferred the solitude of the underground scene. After all, that was the type of he'd decided he was meant to be. And it certainly did jibe with the so-called scheduled habits of one who had to attend to scholastic ideologies and schedules. Underground hero work was the smarter choice, the logical path for him to take given that he hated the limelight and the pandering one had to do to appease the public. To him, that marketability tied to heroism didn't fit the description of what a hero ought to care about. Sure, those popular sort were heroes in their own right with their powers and keen sense of justice. But signing autographs and doing interviews? It didn't make sense to Shoyuta. He didn't need it. He didn't want it. But you need a team, Sho. But that was a comment and idea that he was certain Oboro had been wrong about. He didn't need a team, didn't want that responsibility any more than he had thought he'd wanted to be here as a teacher. That liability. He wasn't fit for it. It wasn't right for him. It'd never work out in the long run. And somehow, someway, Shoyuta was always going to see things unravel. Mostly because the man shook his head and stared hard at the screen, projecting the match in front of him, obscuring the true goings-ons within the mock cityscape of the team trials for classes 1A and 1B. The oddity of it still struck him. Standing here as a teacher, he wasn't cut out for this. He couldn't impart knowledge, didn't rightly know how to teach worth a DMN. Not in the way that others could. Not in a way that mattered or lasted. Not in a way that changed people for the better. No, this wasn't a good fit for him. Shoyuta wasn't quite good enough for this, and that strange sting always made him feel a bit sour. So he'd grouse about the fact that he'd rather focus on his work, his ability to blend with the shadows, take down villains without being known. No need or time for anything or anyone else. You'd make a great teacher, you know. The man couldn't help but wince at that memory, as it always seemed pop up whenever those doubts tended to linger and itch. He could always recall, with too startling of clarity, the flash of a smile in his mind's eye at the thought of those words falling from that particular mouth on that day. A snapshot of an ideal and a dream before everything sort of went to shit. Of course, Shirakumo Oboro had often been right about a lot, which was kind of annoying in its own right. Shoyuta could admit to that much, even if he was loath to do so. You'd make a great teacher? But this message? This comment was another instance Shoyuta was certain he'd have to deny Shirakumo the honor of being correct. There was no way it could be so. Oboro had been wrong about it. And not just mildly wrong, mind you, but completely and utterly wrong. The man didn't need a team, and he certainly didn't need to teach either. He didn't need either one of them. Shoyuta never would have made a good partner in a team, and he was a sheet teacher at best, often reducing his students to tears. But the blue-haired boy had been idealistic like that, always seeing the things in people that didn't necessarily exist. Hoping to will them into life, maybe. Like Shuta's lack of skill at dealing with children. Hell, the man couldn't even interact with people his own age. What would ever make anyone think he'd be a good teacher? It was ridiculous. Absolutely. And yet, somehow, he'd been lured into it all, persuaded to consider it. Teaching. Mostly thanks to Kayama, he'd been brought into the administrative offices, drawn forward by Nizu to consider a course in teaching at UA of all places. Teaching. A temporary thing, I assure you, the principal had said, kindly enough too. He still doesn't know why he'd said yes. Because you're sentimental like that. Teach. The man gripped his pen tightly, narrowing his gaze on the scurrying of shadows through the haze of the dust cloud on the screen as the fifth matchup of the team trials started with a literal bang. Shoyuta wasn't sentimental by any stretch of the imagination. Yet, here he was now, a few years later, still in that temporary field, having taught a few courses and dealt with more than one dismissal of problematic classes. Not that he dismissed the hopeful, prospective heroes out of malice or a bad temper, though that's not how they saw it, perhaps. Rather, he dismissed them because they were the ones with the greatest things to lose. And Shoyuta wasn't keen on helping them towards that demise, far from willing to have their lives cut short when they fell as heroes because they couldn't make the cut, because the world could be cruel. Because they didn't have an understanding of what it was going to entail. You didn't even give us a chance. The slew of insults and anger he received from child and parent alike hadn't swayed him. He remained fixed in his assertions about their standing in his class, about the truth they faced, and the inevitable end they'd find waiting for them. And they would have found it. He could see that they would. Their hearts, while in the right place, were not prepared for the rigors and pain and danger the hero world presented. It wasn't just a paycheck, and it certainly wasn't about glamour or prestige or your name on a ranking sheet. Real lives were on the line, the victims they would inevitably try to rescue. As well as themselves. Many seemed to forget that, including the ones he'd dismissed, refusing to teach, refusing to give false hope to. Let them learn the truth that way, with an actual hero telling them they weren't ready, telling them the truth of their liability status. Let them realize that pandering and disobedience to adhering to the rigors and realities of heroism would lead to death and disgrace without having that happen in the field. It was far less complicated that way. Far more rational and far less painful for the family that got to keep their idiotic child just a little longer. Even if it did set him at odds with most of mainstream hero society. But all of this begged the question of why stood next to Vlad King, Kiyama, and All Might, staring up at a screen, observing one of the foolhardiest, overly ambitious would-be heroes he'd ever had the opportunity to meet racing across the cameras. One he hadn't expelled, though part of him felt compelled to do so, despite all of the warnings that said he should, that it would be better for Shoyuta in the long run. That it'd be better for the child. And normally things would be that clear-cut, he'd be capable of making the rational choice and letting the boy loose, cut from his class and facing the hard reality of truth that could be his future if he continued on his trajectory. You're nothing more than a liability in battle. Broken bones, more than once, more than willingly shattered. Irrational behavior, foolhardy and impulsively exhibited without a thought or care for himself, as he deliberately put himself in harm's way simply to prove a point or complete whatever task it was he'd set his mind to. Disrespect for any and all rules when it suited him and when those rules stood in the way of him getting what he wanted. When he was protecting others. Shoyuta frowned as he stared at the screen, his fingers curling in towards his palms as he assessed the smaller things, watching carefully, feeling the tingling of something being off. Wrong. Different. Everything about the situation prior to this moment, the team trials, insisted that the boy be let go, forced to step back from hero training. And yet the heroics of the boy's actions towards others insisted that he stay. And that was the issue, wasn't it? Protecting others. The child that was a problem and a penchant for making a muck-up of all rational behavior only tended to do so when someone else's life was on the line. He disregarded the rules when he was a hero. What's your kid doing, Aizawa? The underground hero blinked slowly towards Vlad, noting the way the other's eyes had caught onto the oddities much as Shoyuta had. Though, unlike Shoyuta, Vlad's gaze flashed with amusement, the sly grin on the man's face a none-too-subtle giveaway of his true intentions behind the question and comment. It was a criticism. What's your kid doing? Part of Shoyuta couldn't fault Vlad's reaction, the confusion and judgment in his tone and gaze as he observed the battle, the way the students squared off in this training exercise. But it was only part of him that could rationalize such because Vlad didn't know Izuku Midoriya like Shoyuta did. And there was the difference. And the reason that the boy remained on the hero track. He remained should a student. Because Shoyuta knew him. Knew the boy and understood him, at least to some degree, and could figure out his thoughts and recognize some of what was driving the boy forward. The good and the bad of it all. And it made that strange sort of pang flicker as he considered the familiarity of it, though he didn't quite know the source of why it was so familiar. This kid. Your kid. But back to the matter at hand. Looks like he's deflecting your student, Shoyuta replied to Vlad easily, pursing his lips, as he tilted his chin into his capture weapon. Which is what he's supposed to do. Quite successful at it too. A sidelong glance shifted towards the blood hero as Shoyuta quirked a brow briefly, challenging the man who'd spent the morning making harsh critiques of his students, picking them apart with little concern for the truth of his statements. Can't say how well your student's faring though. The underground hero's ears picked up the soft sputter and huff of annoyance at his rebuttal as he turned back to the screen, watching the spar unfold in real time. Shuda's gaze narrowed on the blood that dribbled from Izuku Midoriya's cheek and the dark grin that lit the child's face. It was a somewhat terrifying sight, if he were honest, especially with the toxic lightning that framed the emerald eyes and sparked around the boy's frame. And though he couldn't, and wouldn't, ignore the small flicker of pride in how Izuku managed to outpace Monoma with sheer speed, and dodging a blow as the copycat quirk holder edged closer and used his borrowed power to launch an assault, there was something else that caught the man's eye. Shoyuta could spy something else lingering in Midoriya's expression, something that picked at his attention and kept Shuda's eyes riveted to the match. The underground hero moved closer to the barrier, keeping an eye on the screen as he sidestepped away from the platform. Dark boots easily shifted, stepping to position himself atop the piping that ran along the perimeter between the observation area, the massive screen, and the battleground itself as his fingers twitched, the muscles in his legs taut and coiled to spring into action. Something felt off. He blinked and swallowed back that fear, that worry for the boy in green and his team, fighting against Shinso and the others. The man frowned deeper and considered his rationalizations for it, uncertain and frustrated by the fact. Why was he so worried? He didn't have a solid answer for it, didn't have any rational understanding of why something was eating at him, begging for his attention. "You're slow today, Sho." Unease was burbling in the pit of his stomach as Shoyuta took stock and truly studied Problem Child's gaunt face and pinched expression. Yes, that look was in part due to the stress of the battle before him. Anyone would look stressed when facing a battle like this, even in a mock setting. But that look, that color or lack thereof, on the boy's face, was something the underground hero had caught a glimpse of prior to the start of the match. And he'd done nothing about it. Not registered that there was anything wrong. Until now. But something was wrong. Very wrong. But in true Problem Child fashion, of course, the boy was ignoring it. And the man hated to admit it, so had Shoyuta. The underground hero had been far more caught up in his agitation than his attentiveness towards those he'd promised to look after. "I've got your back. When one of us fails, the others can pick up the slack." The man's nose twitched, and he grit his teeth, pen still in hand, paper at the ready for his notes and assessment of the fight before him. He half listened to Vlad's disgruntled rumblings, watching the screen carefully as the battle continued between the two fighters. Midoriya was good at dodging, using his speed and the boost he used from his quirk's energy reserves to increase his momentum whenever he stepped as he let his quirk ignite through his fingertips. Problem Child took a chance as he scrambled forward, ducked low and aimed to lobby a strike to Monoma's stomach, his Air Force blast angled to the blonde boy's sternum. The boy was panting, a snarl on his face as he glared towards the other's laugh, small metal bolts carrying the kid aloft. "Call off the match." Monoma was quick to rebound, much to his credit, and managed to twist between some of the larger piping before Midoriya charged forward again and leapt upward and prepared another series of strikes to defend himself against the onslaught that was coming his way. Clearly he was undeterred, or rather ignoring those deterrents. He was playing the long game, trying to get Monoma to make a misstep. It was a move the man had seen before on Midoriya's part. A blind ignorance to the pain he was feeling, adrenaline-fueling action. Broken arms, his mind recalled softly as the image of Midoriya's shattered body during their forest training filtered through his mind's eye. He'd had a hard time forgetting that, watching as the boy saved Kuda, when he tried to save Bakugo. It was a hard reminder of the foolhardiness of this would-be hero. Shoyuta could feel his worry spike as he shuffled his feet, ready to leap towards the teams, ready to cease the match if it came down to it, even if Midoriya looked hell-bent on finishing his job and helping 1A succeed. True, he didn't sport any broken bones, yet, but that didn't assuage the agitation Shoyuta could feel growing as he studied the interactions between Monoma and Izuku, the way the blonde seemed to dominate the field, using the metal shrapnel and bolts and connectors, like weapons and flight enhancers, all while Midoriya dodged, and was struck from behind, forcing him into a near stumble. A good hit for Monoma, Aizawa? Vlad's voice echoed nearby as Shoyuta stayed fixated on the images, notating the signs he could see. Hands trembled. Knees seemed to shake as Problem Child nearly faltered into a stumble, however briefly. But the boy returned to his feet, returned to the fight, that glint growing brighter in his gaze, a hard smile flashing across his mouth as more blood trickled from his busted lip. "You see, Sensei, I'm still standing. This kid. His kid. Problem Child." Izuku hadn't anticipated Monoma to be so aggressive in launching an offensive assault, and he should have been. He knew what the boy was capable of, what his quirk entailed. And yet he'd believed, like a moron, that it wouldn't be this way. That was a mistake on his part. Given that the other boy's quirk was copying another's, it didn't leave Monoma with much offensive power, at least not like Ishido, Uraraka, and he had. His team had some sort of offensive quirk at their disposal, while the blonde copying hero was at a severe disadvantage physically unless he could copy someone else's quirk with relative ease or trained in a similar way to Shinso or even a pro hero like Knight. Not those thoughts. The boy halted the analysis before it could solidify in his mind, determined to push away that darker shroud of thought and memories that threatened to fall if he'd let it. A shiver ran down his spine as his hand trembled. He didn't need that memory now of all times, here with the perceived enemy in front of him. There was nothing else to worry about, nothing else to care about. So, he would focus on analyzing if he could, focus on the first thought about Monoma's limitations, though the pounding behind his eyes made it hard to really do that much. Which was frustrating. Quit being so weak, Izuku. A familiar voice hummed in his ear as he hissed low and glared. He wasn't weak. He ignored the injustice of his body betraying him in favor of speculating and trying to understand just who Monoma was as a fighter, what his strengths and weaknesses were. He's copied the others' quirks. But is there a limit to their uses? There has to be. Right? Though Izuku was able to adjust after taking the blow to the back, using his reinforced boots to kick back another pipe move his way, he had to admit that Monoma was definitely pressing his advantage here. He seemed to know more about Izuku and how to get the upper hand. It's like staying in Hosu. The thoughts swirled idly through the haze of thoughts as Izuku considered what that knowledge meant, how he should best proceed, what it could do to help him. Surely it could help him, right? He hadn't known Stain's quirk then either, though he'd had a good idea of its possibilities given all the reports that had surrounded the villain's attacks, Ida's brother being among them. Still, that fight was only a success because he'd had Ida and Todoroki on his side, the three of them working in tandem to overwhelm the hero killer and take him down through sheer exhaustive repetitive attacks. They'd been lucky because of their numbers and friendship, and because they knew how to trust each other. But this was different. Here Izuku was alone. He didn't have the ability to call on others to help offset and distract. So what knowledge he did have about Monoma's quirk was limited at best and wouldn't do him much good if he didn't have a solid plan of attack and could figure out what the other's threshold of power was. Could he copy multiple quirks? How long did they last? As long as he concentrated on them or when he switched to a different quirk? The boy hummed softly as he considered the prospects of the situation, a wary glance around showing the hovering of small metal objects floating nearby as Monoma moved easily behind a pillar and out of Izuku's sight. It doesn't seem likely that he could only copy one quirk at a time since he's already showing that he can use the different quirks of his teammates here. But only one at a time? The boy frowned and tensed, curling his fingers into tight fists as warmth spread from his chest and towards his fingertips. His quirk sparked brighter as he kicked up the percentage he was using to deflect another rapid series of metal shrapnel rocketing towards him. He'd anticipated the attack. Using his Air Force blast, Izuku pushed a gust of air outward, creating a pressurized resistance that got most of Monoma's arsenal caught in the field of his blast and away from their intended target, him. Still, some maneuvered beyond his power and struck downward, raining on the boy's head. Despite the way Izuku twisted midair to avoid it, he was struck hard against his temple and forehead and forced back into a mini retreat that had him scowling, the air around him feeling overly warm in his agitation and the frenzy of having to move so quickly. The boy's heart was beating in his ears. Well, that sort of dotty, and judging by Monoma's laughing, as he hovered lightly above the rooftop, seemed he thought so too. The blonde smirked, eyes bright and an apparent manipulation of metal in the soles of his shoes to give him lift, as tilted his head. "I seem to have misjudged you," the boy crowed, peering down on Izuku, a sneer in his gaze. "See, I believed what everyone said about you. How strong you were, so I gave you far too much credit, believing you were that good." The kid laughed again and raised a palm, a gestured wave to beckon him forward, each standing together, within the strike zone. And the more Izuku stood here, with his power crackling as Monoma laughed at his expense, the more his thoughts swirled into a muddled mess of speculation and concern. Izuku was certainly worried that he'd underestimated his peer's prowess too, though his perception a much kinder observation than the one leveled at him. He remembered Monoma vaguely from the sports festival, though after his battle against Bakugas in getting what he wanted, defeating his opponent. As a hero ought. But where did one draw the line? Where did that power reach its end? No one was limitless, not even Aizawa-sensei or All Might. Everyone had their drawbacks, that threshold where they couldn't quite reach past and push beyond. So, where's his limit? The wielder of One for All slammed into the rooftop of the building, well below Monoma, panting as the world swayed. He hastily wiped at his cheek, crimson staining his white gloves as he blinked furiously to steady himself. Izuku's stomach rolled as he swallowed back his annoyance. Minoma had to know Izuku would be wary of getting close to him lest he have his quirk copied, though. Izuku wasn't so sure that was entirely possible given the nature of One for All. There was always that off chance that Izuku could march up to the blonde and not have the other boy capable of copying the quirk that had evolved since it was first created. It had had different wielders that had made it stronger, impacted how it would act. Was it possible to replicate that then? Realistically, Izuku could test this out, could try to punch the other boy in the face if he wanted, and a small part of him could admit that he wanted to do just that rather than playing this cat and mouse game, and test to see if it was possible for Minoma to copy his quirk and use One for All against him. If I did get close and was able to take him out without worrying about my quirk being copied, that could give us a big advantage. However, Izuku wasn't stupid. Nor was he keen to lose. So, best not to test the theory and put his team in danger. They needed him to do this. They needed him to succeed. Not to mention the fact that he didn't need anyone to ask questions about how he was able to bypass Minoma's quirk at all. That was a little more inquiry that he really needed to deal with. Secret quirk and all. It was important to keep that secret safe. For everyone's sake. So, he'd do his damnedest to succeed in the smarter way, the more rational manner as his sensei would say. But how to do that? You're slow, aren't you? That's a shame. Here I thought we'd have an all-out fight. Minoma crowed with another bright laugh to Izuku's left. The verdant-haired wielder of One for All let an airstrike fly with a rapidity that forced a blur of blonde to duck low. I've heard what you and Bankagu did to get suspended. I figured you'd be just as reckless and stupid now. You aren't necessarily known for strategy. Not like the rest. The boy narrowed his eyes, brows drawing close as he bit his lip to and concentrated on listening for movement, trying to block out the rather deliberate attempt to get Izuku to retaliate. His fingers were positioned at the ready for another attack. If he's copied the other quirks where he can float using metal objects, then he has to have brainwashing at his disposal too. There was a clattering of metal striking metal and a moment of hesitation on his end as Izuku scanned the pipework that crisscrossed overhead, the patches of cloudy, blue sky peeking through the gaps, searching, straining to peek an advantage. But no sign of his opponent. Izuku tensed clenching his teeth. Minoma continued to laugh, the harsh timbre a grating noise that bounced around the metalwork and made the boy scramble to pinpoint a location. Sheet. Oh, isn't this funny? And here I thought you were the golden child, the number one. Minoma crooned as Izuku touched down on a rooftop, quirk firing around him. Where is he? A green glare snapped around, peering into shadows, seeking out the coat and cufflinks, glints from the boy's buttons, anything that would give the kid's location away. But maybe I was wrong about that then? Maybe it's Bakugu who is the real golden boy. Another flurry of metal screws and bolts shot towards Izuku, who twisted his shoulder and dipped into a backwards stumble to avoid more injury. To the right. Izuku drew a blast towards the large pipe that stood upright, a beacon against the gray wall behind it, sending a reverberating echo to the surrounding area. It made him wince. He spied a flutter of a dark jacket as Minoma drew behind the piped pillar, Izuku sending another Air Force shot following after the boy. Green lightning swirled in the air. This blast chipped a section of the metalwork, tearing the sheet and rivets away from the pipe, while denting the thing in the middle, well above where the boy's head might be, but still low enough and impactful enough to startle the kid. There was another flurry of movement. Izuku could see the boy's shadow shift, though Minoma never vacated his position. I have to get him to move without getting too close to him or he'll copy my quirk, the boy muttered in his head, eyes zeroing in on the damage his first Air Force strike elicited. If he could weaken it more, perhaps he could draw the other out? But how to do that? Nice shot there, golden boy. I was nearly caught off guard, the blonde snipped out. Perhaps you need glasses though? You definitely missed. Izuku frowned and leapt, readying another shot. Maybe from higher up. There was a jolt down his arm, and the boy snarled silently, a shudder working through him. Come on, Izuku. Just concentrate. I need to just get a shot in and hit him. I have to focus my shot so I can stun him. Stun him, not kill him. The boy's eyes widened, and he shook his head at the absurdity of the thought. Of course, he'd stun him and not. He knew that. With a higher vantage point, Izuku angled his arm downward, giving a strong pulse of power into the Air Force strike. 20%. Stun, not kill. The force of the blast and its recoil had Izuku knocked lightly backwards as the gust of air snapped through the autumn chill and slammed into the metal pipe. There was a crunch and the snapping of sheeting as more rivets were torn out, weakening the structure further. Damn it, still too wide, the would-be hero ground out, agitatedly as his vision dipped to dimmer hues. His hands shook as a chill slipped down his spine. Another flurry of small metal pieces struck at his cheek, scraping the corner of his eye, forcing the boy to squeeze them shut in surprise, a small pinprick of warmth trailing like a tear down his cheek. Though it wasn't salt but rust that fell. He ignored it and the laugh that followed. Guess I have the better aim, eh, golden boy? Another wince as the pressure behind Izuku's eyes seemed to flare at the slight leveled at him. A shiver ran down his spine. The boy shook his head to clear his thoughts, to recenter, to focus. He couldn't get agitated. He needed to be calm about this. Stop that. Gotta breathe, Izuku. Right, breathe. He needed to breathe and just hold on a little longer, wait until the signal, until reinforcements could help him. What's more, he needed to focus his attention on a more precise shot. And quickly. You're not very good at this, you know, Monoma's voice sounded light, if a bit muffled, to Izuku's ears. He continued to taunt the one-for-all user with a laugh, as the verdant-haired boy landed and immediately launched upward again, strike at the ready. The wind whipped through the boy's hair, ruffling the green as it beat against his cheeks, making Izuku wince. Maybe I was wrong about you, the other boy continued as Izuku let out a blast that shattered the remaining integrity of the metal pipe, forcing the copycat quirker to maneuver out of the way, ducking behind a second piped pillar. Damn it. Maybe you aren't the golden boy of Class 1A after all. There was a laugh. Izuku didn't wait for a reply as he charged forward this time, well aware that he was the only line of defense between the other team and his teammates who were advancing far more slowly than he. He had to get the field open for them, give Ochako and Mina a chance to get in close and really get a solid shot in to take down more of 1B's teammates. Maybe they could take Monoma to the holding area. If he could just stun the kid long enough. Izuku's head gave a painful throb, the headache that had been simmering ignored in the heat of the moment breaking through his concentration and making him hiss, vision swimming from the sudden onslaught. A creaking of metal as the pipe fractured further, had the boy squinting through a haze of pressure building in his head and the watering of his eyes. It hurt. And wasn't that annoying because Izuku didn't have time for it to hurt. He had to focus. You have to be stronger. Quit complaining so much. He needed to stop complaining. He needed to be better. He was fine. And, thankfully, through the pain, an idea sparked. A potentially stupid idea, yes, and one that banked on the haste and irrationality of the opponent, only capable of working if the other boy made the first move. But at least it was an idea. Pin him down. The verdant-haired child blew out a long, shaky breath, agitation flickering through his fingers and into his veins as he considered his prospects, feet touching down on the rooftop, toxic lighting erupting beneath the soles of his shoes. Pin him down. The boy leapt again, and scanned the area from his mid-air position, searching for movement from the other side of the metal pillar, hands at the ready. He could do this. Another jolt of pain struck his temples. Izuku grit his teeth and narrowed his eyes. He could do this. Izuku just needed to be patient, just needed Monoma to do the hard part for him. A flash of pink shifted to his right, a small hand signal catching his attention briefly. A shadow shifted, a dark mark against the glinting silver of the metal that surrounded. Izuku tensed, fingers curling into position. Seemed he wouldn't have to wait long for that to happen either. Perfect. Another flash of pink, this one far closer, whipped close to the pillar, high above the copy quirker's grip as Uraraka drew her fingers together and released her quirk's hold on the large shards of metal she'd collected on her way to Monoma's position. There was a tense moment of silence, the chilly breeze whistling through the pipework before jagged and somewhat singed pieces of scrap fell downward, straight towards the blond boy hiding behind the pillar that blocked him from Izuku's view. Or rather had blocked him. Now though? F-. The wielder of One for All bit back a grin at the way Monoma swore as he scurried from behind the pillar, trying to dodge the onslaught of debris coming his way, falling hard and fast. And though precision wasn't there, there was enough debris dropping that it would be immensely difficult for Monoma to dodge everything, even if he was quick. Perfect. Izuku kicked a move into his feet, focusing his power to produce more lightning at the soles. This propelled the boy downward, towards the scurrying enemy, Uraraka floating up and overhead before Monoma could get close to her. The floating hero lifted 2 fingers upward, the digits going overhead in a simple peace sign, signaling to the other pink hero to make the next move. And Mina didn't hesitate, skating out from beneath a series of larger pipes. With a wicked grin and using her acid as skates, the girl pressed her own hands together and created a pressured blast of her acid shot, leveling an assault against the blonde boy who was now forced to contend against falling debris and acid alike. Rather than striking Monoma directly, though, Mina's acid stream worked on the piping overhead the copy quirker. Izuku's hawkish gaze caught the maneuver and the bright grin and nod that was angled towards him from the acid quirker who winked easily, another of her shots falling. Finally, it appeared that someone was returning the fire that Monoma had thrown at Izuku, though judging by the way in which the 2 other opponents with 1B were trailing after Mina and Ochako, the trio of 1A students didn't have a lot of time to end the fight and take the opponents into custody. That meant Izuku had to hurry. With a sniff and gritting his teeth, the boy upped his power level, pushing towards 40%, before he forced his concentration into channeling that energy into this next Air Force strike. He wanted maximum effect. His muscles protested the strain as he let another shot fly, angling for the same spot Ishido had a moment before. Like a bullet, the blast was met with the distinct echo of metal striking metal. A deep scraping sound tickled Izuku's ears as he panted from the push of power at his fingertips, but prepared another shot, another blast of power. Another distraction for the copy quirker to try to contend again as the second shot mimicked the first and slammed into the same spot of the metal piping that had started to corrode and disintegrate thanks to Ishido's acid. A weakness that Izuku exploited, forcing the bonds in the pipe to break down further as heavy strikes of power were smacked into the framework, the repeated assaults finally cracking through, denting, and tearing at the stability of the metalwork. There was a groan and another curse. F-. The pipe tipped and toppled downward towards the blonde boy, pushing the copy quirker onto his hands and knees as that same pipe struck against the side of 2 other parallel pipes on either side. The debris caught around Monoma, creating a tent of scrap metals that contained the copy quirker, whose leg got stuck up in the debris, and pinned him in place. It was almost like he'd just been caged like an animal. And at that realization that he'd been snatched and contained, pale blue eyes snapped to Izuku as the boy struggled to right himself and push away the smaller pieces of metal that kept a firm hold on the other's location. Like a rat in a trap. A pulse of satisfaction wormed through Izuku's senses at the sight, at the angry reaction the blonde had towards Uraraka as she touched down and grinned through her helmet down on her enemy. The girl kicked a few more pieces of debris onto Monoma as Mina, too, moved closer, hedging a bet on their ability to capture this member of the 1B team they were vying against, without any further interruption. Uraraka caught the boy's attention, her waving and gesturing for Izuku to look behind him and continue onward as she brought out her roll of capture tape. She nodded and grinned. "Go ahead, Deku." The silent command was apparent in the ease of her gaze, the trust that swirled in chocolate orbs. She knew they were under a time crunch, knew that she could handle what and who was before them, even if it did set Izuku a little ill at ease to leave the others behind to pursue the next targets. Mina gave a thumbs up in agreement as she hastily set a barrier of acid around Monoma, to prevent the boy from moving as the zero-gravity quirker moved some of the large pieces of debris in order to throw the capture tape out and bind Monoma's hands and the source of his quirk's power together so he couldn't copy either Uraraka's or Mina's quirks. Both of them nodded again as Monoma groaned, a bit of frustration in his tone as he struggled to stand. That FNG hurt. He bit out evenly, his glare striking through Izuku, as the phantom thief slowly stumbled to his feet, Mina keeping a constraining stream of acid surrounding the boy who dusted himself off slowly. Almost villainous how you did that. Trying to kill someone, Midoriya? The antagonizing was there, the deliberate smirk apparent to Izuku, as he stared down at the blonde copycat quirker for a moment, spying the glower Uraraka had clearly offended for him. Another wave from Mina with an encouraging smile, had Izuku stretching his fingers out even as he considered what Monoma said. Perhaps. The boy frowned, brows twitching as he considered the truth that perhaps it had been intentional. Did Monoma throw the match on purpose? It was certainly a plausibility, and as the boy hastily wiped the water that was pooling at the corners of his eyes burning and itching, he couldn't help the tense stress that dripped down his spine and slipped into his veins. Has the other boy really anticipated their plans so thoroughly? Certainly, they'd have suspected that Izuku would have been in the lead of his team if they'd chosen a frontal assault. He was the faster of the four of them. The copy quirk holder snapped out, as Izuku barreled forward, feet catching the side of a building, green lightning skating along metal. You don't have to be so dmed rough about it. Uraraka let out a small giggle, though she said nothing as a retort, mindful to keep the plan in play should the other target start to utilize his quirk and take control of cognitive function. Izuku couldn't help his own grin, however strained it was, the tension still high, a wariness for the unexpected and dangerous still lingering in his senses. Danger was close by. Then again. Maybe not though, he thought tiredly, maybe we're lucky and he hadn't thought Ochako and Mina a threat. Maybe. You have to concentrate, kid. A voice whispered harshly in his ear, making Izuku shake his head in surprise. You can't control anything if you can't concentrate and keep your emotions in check. The boy nearly stumbled in this descent, moving his feet in a sideways motion at the last second to avoid tumbling as the voice continued to hum and buzz. A chill slithered down his spine as he repressed a shudder and kept moving forward, heart hammering wildly, breath hitching as he fought back the uncomfortable sloshing in his stomach. One for all. Was acting. Strange. Izuku let out a low gasp as he curled his hands tightly into fists. He didn't need this now. He didn't need this again, facing off against Shinso like he had in the sports festival. Having that vision there. Hearing those hushed whispers then. Hearing them now. Izuku blinked a few times, hastily brushing the saltiness from his eyes. Droplets of reds mixed with the tears. He was fine. He was. Concentrate, damn it. Right. Concentrate. Too bad it was Bakugo's fault that All Might was forced to retire, right? There was a jolt, a fierce ache flaring in his chest as the green-haired boy touched down, barely hesitating for a moment before springing forward and upward, giving himself enough height to peer down on his opponent. Anger at Monoma's words struck, a warmth washing over him as agitation immediately took hold. The tingling in his fingers increased, a sharp lancing pain jabbing his skulls as he squinted at his enemy. Izuku knew he had to block it. Out, close it off and just focus on the task at hand, the enemy before him. Maybe it's your fault too, eh? The blonde's voice was louder, condescending, jeering as Izuku bit the inside of his cheek, considering the familiarity of the feeling of inadequacy that wormed through him. A cough remained lodged in his chest. You're not a worthy successor. Nothing but a liability. Reckless. A flurry of movement to his left had Izuku turning a sharp eye towards the shadows that lurked, as a muffled grumble tickled the boy's ears, Monoma's sharp insults continuing to sail through the air, following after the lightning at Izuku's heels. The others were nearby, waiting to strike. But Izuku was faster, could be faster. Keep going. Another stumble forced the boy to scrape his palms against the ledge of a building, pushing faster than he'd originally anticipated in his haste to get to Shinso, to take down the next opponent and outrun the others. He could hear Mina's acid spray splattering against metal, hissing and corroding the resistance and barrier between 1S and 1BS teams respectively, forcing the others to remain hidden and draw further into the shadows. Izuku corrected that stumble by slamming into a massive pipe running astride his trajectory. The force of his feet connecting to the metal left a sizable dent as he pushed off, one for all singing in his veins. Maybe screaming. Careful, golden boy. Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself. A painful twinge struck his temples as a disquiet continued to grow within him, the doubts returning fresh to the forefront. The nightmares sparked anew with each breath he breathed in and each laughing word that fell from his opponent's lips. You'll never get a handle on this power. You don't deserve something you can't control. You ruined All Might. Izuku's eye twitched. The cough that had been lodged spilling from his lips as he tried to level out his breathing. Had he ruined All Might? He could have won had you not taken his quirk. There was a small sliver of black that touched the corners of his vision as the boy swallowed and trained his eye on the amethyst-haired enemy, friend, before him. The world felt too bright, the air too cold. His arms were aching as he lifted his fingers to strike with an air force gust at the same time that Shinso curled his fingers around his capture weapon. You're never going to be good enough. Another spark of black ate at his vision. A buzzing was ringing in his ears. His fingers started to tingle painfully as gray material snapped around his wrist. Izuku twisted his hand and pulled, fingers entwining with the fabric, creating a tension between himself and Shinso, one the other couldn't pull entirely away from unless he let go of his capture weapon. Izuku let his Air Force blast fly, but his hands were shaking so badly that the gust curved to the right and sailed past Shinso's ear, barely ruffling the brainwashing quirk holder's hair with its flyby. A shudder ran through him as Shinso returned Izuku's tense pull with one of his own, drawing the verdant-haired boy forward, sparks flying as the pair collided, Shinso's fist striking Izuku's stomach. Spit flew from the boy's mouth as he wheezed from the blow, his own arm rising to strike the taller boy in the shoulder and neck, the force of their respective hits snapping each boy to different directions. Neither waited from the other to catch their breath before they were repositioning themselves and charging forward again, Shinso reworking his grip on his capture weapon as Izuku sprang upward and gripped his dominant wrist with his other hand, trying to steady his next Air Force blast. He'd never had to do that before, but this time it was a necessity. As he struggled to straighten his shot, angling his fingers, he couldn't help but notice that growing tingle in his fingertips, and the chill that settled in the veins of his hands, moving towards his wrists. This is wrong. Something's wrong. Concentrate. With shaking hands, the boy tried to steady himself to get a shot in, his fingers struggling to maintain the strength of their positioning. Focus. The buzzing in his ears grew louder, a hum whirring as the tingling in his hands spread to his wrists and zipped up his arms. It hurt. Deku. The boy started, blinking furiously as he tried to force his breathing to slow, to steady, to ease. He couldn't figure out where the voice was coming from. Who it was coming from. Deku. Hey. Was that Shinso or Ochako? The boy couldn't be sure as he frowned, shiver working through him, sweat matting his temples now as droplets slithered down past his ear. He had to keep going. Concentrate. Concentrate. It was hard to do though. Izuku's breathing felt too loud in his ears, each inhale like the whistling of a hurricane as time seemed to slow, the world dimming. It felt too hot all of a sudden even as prickles and goosebumps lifted the hair on his arms. Something was wrong. I'm fine. Concentrate. Something was wrong. Deku. And he couldn't. Izuku only had a moment to blink before his hands started shaking as Shinso's capture weapon snapped outward, towards him once more. That seemed to be the breaking point. Time slowed to a crawl, Izuku's breathing loud and heavy and drawn as One for All sparked at his fingertips. The fierce aches that had been tingling up his arm flared before erupting into midnight tendrils of power, black and spindly and terrifying in their weight and ferocity. And suddenly, as the dark marks sprang forth shooting outwards, time seemed to fast forward, noises colliding, the boy's breathing hitching as a new crackling of power swirled in front of his face and struck out in all directions, towards Izuku's opponent and the windows and the wall, haphazard in their assault. Angry. Painful. And now the boy was alert. Sheet. Izuku's vision slipped to black as he lost control and crash-landed atop the roof that had been below him only a moment before. Consumed by a shroud that was dark and absorbed everything around him, Izuku could feel the One for All's uncontrolled power rippling outward from his wrist and fingers. It was so intense, so fierce that Izuku couldn't really comprehend anything else about the world around him. Voices chimed through his head, demanding, chastising. Come on kid, concentrate. You can't just. Izuku was whipped to the side as One for All's power took complete control, pushing him upwards and back as he tried to piece together what the hell was going on and who the hell was speaking to. Deku. Another voice. He knew that voice. Concentrate. Izuku tried to blink, tried to speak, his tongue to fat in his mouth as he swallowed back the bile, his hands burning from the tingling. Colors blurred, framed by the black ribbons of power that struck out at everything that surrounded Izuku. A fiery aching settled in his muscles, his bones screaming in protest at the sudden influx in power. It was like a tap had been broken within One for All, and Izuku could no longer regulate the percentage of power he was giving out. It made it harder to breathe, to blink, to comprehend what was happening. The world was twisting, the ache growing as Izuku tried to stop the whir of power, shut off his connection to One for All. It hurt. Watch out. Deku. The boy grit his teeth, his head aching, tears filling the brims of his eyes as light and energy rippled around him, reopening the cut along his cheek as he pressed one hand over the other again, his fingers spasming, enrobed in the void of dark energy that weaved around his hands and drew a breathless gasp of pain from him. His heartbeat was echoing in his ears now, as he willed the world around him to still, willed the power to cease. He had to stop it. Words and cries, muffled in the whir of power, had Izuku blinking furiously, trying to set the world aright. You accidentally unlocked it. I told you to calm down. The voice. Accidentally unlocked it? Unlocked what? It's not going to anywhere now. It's out there for you, but you have to just stay calm. Gruff and biting and forceful. And loud. This was the same voice back again. The one that had been in his ear earlier was pounding against his skull now, making him swallow back a groan as power ribboned up his arm. Concentrate. Come on, kid, I know you can do it. Hey, Deku? Just listen to my voice, okay? Ochako? She's too close. Too close. Too close. The boy hunched in on himself, trying to wrap his hands closer to his stomach and push the power inward, preventing it from lashing out at anyone. Whatever the hell it was, the hum of electricity whipped him backwards, smacking into a wall as he tried to regain some semblance of control, tried to resist the black tendrils completely overwhelming him. He couldn't. If he hurt anyone. Just Deku, that hey. He couldn't. What was happening? Words were garbled, voices bleeding together, distorting, the world slowing to a crawl before speeding right back up again, as hands wrapped around him, guiding his feet to a solid position. Uraraka? He knew it was her. Float must be activated. But he didn't. Inhale. Exhale. He didn't want to hurt her. He didn't want to hurt anyone. Everything was moving too fast and too slow. And he needed it to end. Damn it, kids, come on. Concentrate. Just trust me. Concentrate. Concentrate. The boy blinked and glared at his hands, feeling the way the power sizzled through the air around him, like lightning striking from his wrists and fingers. This power that it was so wholly unfamiliar that it made the boy worry, fear that something had happened, that he'd broken something within One for All. Because this had never happened to All Might. So. Ni. The muscles in his arms were spasming as he pushed away from Ochako, tried to create a distance between the pair of them. He didn't want to hurt her. He didn't want. A glint of black in the shadow of his vision had panic spiking as the world tilted. Blonde, melded with the gray around him, and he felt up through the haze of pain and agitation, a pressure, air, and the distinct sensation of a swipe of a hand nearby. The boy twisted out of reflex, his joints creaking and aching in protest, as the black ribbons of power struck out harder and faster. His foot struck a stomach, however, leaving a dusty footprint on a dark suit coat. Izuku knocked into Uraraka in his haste to back away from Minoma, who'd managed to break free from Ochako's and Mina's hold because of Izuku's failure. Stay back, he wanted to shout, to convince his lips to move to speak those words. But none would come as he stumbled away, trying to distance himself from the pair, friend and foe alike. He noted, though, the way the small pieces of metal that had been attached to Minoma's shoes, giving him leverage and speed to maneuver through the air, were no longer glowing. He has a limit, the boy thought half-heartedly as he was snapped back from the whip-like tendrils striking out, wrapping around metal piping, flinging Izuku from side to side. Stop it. He didn't want this. He didn't want any of this. The aching, shuddering, pain. The worry from others. He didn't want them to have to worry about him. He'd promised. You can't just pretend the power doesn't exist, kid. You have to learn to pay attention. Pay attention. How could he pay attention though? He didn't want to deal with this. Not now. But he couldn't. Deku, let's fight. Come on. Let's fight, yeah? The voice cut through the haze, firm and commanding. And questioning. Asking for a response. Izuku blinked, curling in tighter as he tried to force his mouth to move, to respond. He arched his back, blinking, the dimness around the edges of his vision swirling with the sky above, as he threw his head back and nearly snarled in agitation. If he could respond, the boy felt like throwing up, his stomach sloshing as the agonizing ache rippled through his muscles. It was too warm. And too cold. There was a roaring in the boy's ears, and he tried to focus his attention, tried to tamp down the power that liked at him, hissing and snapping in its darkness. Respond. Respond, damn it. He needed to. His mouth felt dry, as he tried to force his attention to remain trained on Shinso, on the present, on the moment where he could get his lips to part and a word to spill forth. Maybe maybe if he just. Come on. Just one word. Just one. There was an influx in power, a strike of pain as black and crimson collided for a brief flicker and a familiar laugh that turned his blood cold, rang out. He spied the idyllic blue of the sky above. Yeah. And there was the exhale, the relief, the small sense of calm that washed over him as he gave up control, resistance snuffed out. Mercifully, Izuku slipped into blissful darkness, wind curling around him with a fierce bite. Deku! Toshinori couldn't stop the shudder that worked through him at the sight and explosion of power. Erratic, midnight tendrils enrobed pale arms, tearing outward in with a ferocity that caused the boy to cry out in pain. It was too soon. The familiar, whomp, tone washed over the man's ears, making something painful twist in his chest at the thought of a familiar face and familiar smile. And the warning his master was giving him now, that threat of one for all still humming within him, relaying a truth he could see playing out before his eyes. Rocked side to side and slammed into the wall, Toshi felt his heart lodge in his throat, as the boy cried out, clutching his hands tightly towards his stomach, the black ribbons of power snaking around fingers and wrists and curling around the boy's shoulders, scratching against his face and up his arms. It had hurt him. Whatever it was. A trill of panic rocketed through the former number 1 hero. Stop the match, he called towards Izuku's sensei, the Erasure hero, eyes sharp as he frowned. He watched Uraraka leapt towards her teammate, tucking beneath the lancing black sparks and tendrils. Izuku curled in tighter on himself, another groan as he seemed to try to be containing the energy, keeping it close to himself, almost like he was pushing the energy back into a ball. But it wasn't working. And the power seemed to take on a will of its own. The power pushed back against the reset limb backwards, skittering across a rooftop as he panted and struggled to contain the power that had erupted from his fingertips and threatened those around him. Stayed back, the boy had panted out over and over, shuddering, sweat trickling down his face. Toshi could see the strain from his position at the entrance of the battle zone, observing Midoriya on the screen. Pilda, please. Something's wrong, Toshi muttered again, taking a step forward, voice pitching low. Aizawa straightened as he caught Toshi's frown and nod towards the underground hero. You need to stop this match now. They both could see something was wrong. Desperately wrong. Midoriya. Fight me. Toshi was grateful, when Izuku had stilled, the power dissipating from the brainwashing quirk and his choked reply to Shinsu's comment, that Aizawa had already started sprinting towards the boy, his movements swift and light. The sight of someone he cared for falling would never sit well with Toshinori. He really should have stopped the matchup before it had begun. And Shoyuda was silently cursing himself for being so dead slow in making that final call when all the signs had pointed. When he could see. Midoriya? The man bit back a snarl, hands balled into fists before reaching towards his throat. Shoyuda sprinted down towards the buildings of the inner cityscape as Problem Child teetered dangerously, shoulders drooping as power dissipated and the boy's eyes rolled back. Sheet! Yeah! A shout went out, low and shaking but determined as the boy spoke the words and fell under Uraraka's touch, not fast enough to catch her friend with her quirk. Go faster, damn it. Thankfully, he'd already been moving when the first flares of darkness erupted, and he could see that panicked, feverish gaze turn inward. He'd been set to use his quirk to settle the trembles of power before Shinso had diffused the situation and calmed the electrified tendrils, and the boy that had tried fruitlessly to stop them himself. Shoyuta grit his teeth. Whatever the hell this was, Problem Child hadn't known about it either, judging by those cries of pain and frustration. The commands to stay away lest he hurt anyone else. Why was it always Problem Child? And he'd been in pain because of it, the keening whine still echoing in Shuta's ears even now as the boy tipped in silence. Deku! A green blur pitched over the side of the roof, and for a moment the man thought that a cloud would have reached out to catch him, as toxic lightning twisted to blue in a blink, the ghost of a memory sparking in the underground hero's mind. But Izuku wasn't a Boro, and nothing was there to catch the unconscious boy. Except you, Sho. Shoyuta growled and stretched his legs, hands shooting out with capture weapons sailing towards the fallen student. Gray snapped through the air, a marked contrast to the blue of the sky, blending with another ribbon of material as a mirrored weapon coiled around one arm, Shuta's capture weapon twisting around the other. A cold gaze snapped to the adjacent rooftop. The underground hero watched Shinso strain to keep his rival aloft in the air, both hands wrapped tightly around his capture weapon, knuckles white from maintaining the tension to keep the other boy aloft. Deku! Uraraka was leaning over the side of the building, eyes wide as she peered between her teacher and her opponent, obvious stress in the pitch and timbre of her voice. Concern. But for all the good it did to see such a companionable worry between friends, Class 1's teacher couldn't quite remedy the flare of panic in his chest as he watched Uraraka lean so far. He couldn't risk having two of his students fall. Step back, Uraraka, he commanded quietly, eyes never straying from the primary object of his consternation. Problem Child dangled, head tilted back, slack, gaunt face unmoving as his arms swayed lifelessly. God damn it. Please. The hard plea seemed to do the trick as he noted, from the corner of his eye, a blur of pink shift backwards, and away from the ledge. Only then did the man let out the breath he'd been holding, heart still hammering against his ribs as he assessed the situation. Even if the girl could float, he wasn't about to risk it. Shoyuta grunted lightly, ears picking up the rapid footfalls of Vlad nearby as he nodded to his student, signaling him to ease his grip on Izuku as Shoyuta edged closer, ready to pull the boy into his hold once Hitoshi released his own. There was a moment of hesitation in the boy's eyes as he considered his options and the silent request made of him. He didn't want to let go, clearly afraid of what might happen, as fingers twitched and tightened around his capture weapon, holding Midoriya aloft. Strain was evident in his shaking shoulders, trepidation apparent in the creases around the boy's eyes as he seemed to seek in a large breath to steady himself before releasing his hold slowly, with a nod of his own. Shoyuta pulled back at the same moment, his grip firm, as his backpedal and yank created a momentum that tugged Problem Child into his secure grip. Coils of gray material, both his own and Shinsu's, swirled around the pair like a ribboned lifeline. The slack weight against his shoulder, heavy and distracting as it was, couldn't temper the sudden flash of concern the man felt at the radiating heat that was rolling off Problem Child in waves. As Shoyuta eased the pair of them down to the ground, gently laying Izuku flat on his back. "Fing hell. What's happened then?" Vlad's voice cut to Shuta's left as he felt the other's presence settle nearby, growing stronger and more pronounced with each smack of a boot against metal and concrete. Shoyuta could acknowledge it, though he refused to turn to his colleague, attention drawn to the boy before him. The more important issue. Fingers reached to Midoriya's throat, checking for a pulse. Standard procedure. With ashen face, flickers of green and black danced along the boy's hands, dim and weak, but still there. A steady thrumming met Shuta's fingers as they searched for the pulse point along the boy's neck, and he was left to give a silent sigh as relief burbled in the man's chest at the assessment's positive outcome. The pulse was steady. A bit weak, but still steady. So, that didn't relieve the agitation he felt growing alongside the worry as Shoyuta took better assessment of Problem Child's condition. He noted dark circles beneath those closed eyes, and a soft wheezing reverberated in the child's chest as he seemed to struggle to breathe deeply. It seemed, by all accounts, that he couldn't even if he tried. And then there was the matter of the heat radiating off the child. Fever. Of course it was. Of course Problem Child would ever deem it appropriate to engage in a fight while in this condition. This demed kid and his ability to not see how dangerous this was. Izuku, the man rumbled softly, his training leading to the next assessment task, as a hand came up to the other's cheek. Kid. He gave Izuku a gentle pat on the side of his face, trying to rouse the boy. Problem Child? Nothing. Lashes never fluttered as the man leaned closer, trying to scan for injury, any other cause to why the boy was currently unconscious before him. Nothing. There was nothing. No broken bones, no lacerations other than the small cut along Midoriya's cheek. Everything seemed relatively normal. However, young Midoriya? I've called for a medic bot. Vlad and All Might were edging closer, their breathing heavy as they leaned over Shoyuta and his ward, long shadows falling over the sleeping boy's face. What's wrong then? Vlad demanded evenly, the question lobbied again towards the underground hero, as though he'd not heard him the first time and as if it was the most important thing to answer. Was he struck by something? Or is he faking it? The other's shadow settled around him as Shoyuta bristled at the jibe and ignored Class 1 BS teacher, focused more on Problem Child's breathing as All Might easily squashed the notion that Izuku would ever forfeit a match because he was too scared to face his opponent. What a stupid thought that was. Clearly Vlad didn't know much about Shuta's Problem Child if he assumed that about the boy. Hell, all Vlad had to do was look at the kid here and now to know that it'd never be the case. He's sick, the underground hero retorted, lowly, a long sigh whistling through his lips as he gently eased the still unconscious boy into a sitting position, wrapping one arm around the boy's waist before pulling the child's other arm around his own shoulder. Of all the ways in which he expected this day to go, this hadn't been one of the scenarios. Though perhaps it should have been? With a still pop in his knees, Shoyuta Aizawa ignored the way the other members of Class 1A and 1B clamored closer, murmurs of questions buzzing between them as they stared at Shuta's attentiveness towards the downed child, eyes wide and unapologetically curious. It all, no wonder Shoyuta needed coffee in the morning in order to deal with this on the regular. He simply didn't have enough resolve to deal with this today. A dark gaze narrowed as heat radiated from his left, the boy continuing to wheeze as Shoyuta fixed his students with a hard glower and frown. Back to class. The medic bot's siren echoed through the breeze as several students started to protest, their cries of indignation a hearty reminder to Shoyuta that they were, still, just children. But sensei, we still have. This isn't up for debate. The man snapped in reply as he adjusted the fevered boy to sit a little straighter as he pulled the boy's tactical belt off to ease some of the burden of weight that the kid bore. Dark lashes fluttered. Shoyuta didn't want to draw his gaze away from the child as the chatter echoed like a wave of sound nearby, words indistinguishable, but panic evident in more than one child's voice, as he eased the child back down. It was grating on the underground hero's resolve as he tamped down his own ire and worry in favor of remaining level-headed and rational, assessing the situation and the needs of the boy before him. Act like you know what you're doing, Sho. Because he ought to know. He was a hero, right? The man sent out a small whistle, drawing his fingers to his lips, letting the shrill noise carry over the chatter, setting the tense air with a siren that stilled the general upheaval. If for a moment, go. Now, he commanded, voice biting, barely flickering his gaze towards the others, quirk blazing, hair curling upward. Don't make me say it again. It's not that he didn't care about them either, despite the somewhat hesitant expressions in a few of his students' gazes. It really wasn't that he wasn't concerned about their questions, their chatter, their voices. But he knew it wouldn't do any good to continue on as they were. In a real scenario, with real victims, there wasn't time for idleness like they displayed. It was very much life and death for those victims. And the minute that boy had pitched into the dark tendrils, the minute he'd cried out in surprise and pain was the minute that this whole thing shifted from a training exercise to an actual emergency. Except it had been long before that too, long before then there'd been problems. And Shoyuta was playing catch-up. Always playing catch-up with this kid. So, there wasn't time for niceties and pandering, and he hoped that his students would understand that, though judging by the affirming nods from Yayorozu and Ida, as they called the rest of their class to return to the lockers to change, that whatever misconceptions had been interpreted on his students' parts, the class representative and second-in-command would help set things right. He hoped. He had to trust it would. The man turned back to his task as cool fingers returned towards the boy's throat, feeling the thrumming of a beat and pulse again for reassurance, the chalky pallor on the child's cheeks still setting Shoyuta into a speculative worry as he considered the reasons behind the current ghost of a child he saw before him now. Feverish. The man shifted the hood of the boy's costume, pushing it to the side in order to make the boy more comfortable, as he unwound his capture weapon, tucking it beneath the unconscious child's head. Next, reaching for the gloves, the large, cumbersome things they were, Shoyuta released the mechanism on the side in order to slip them off the boy's hands, momentarily struck by rough, jagged scars still so prominent on problem child's hands. Next went the boots, off the child's feet, the metal a weight the boy didn't need to bear given his current state. But before Shoyuta could reach for the metal clasps that secured the boots to the child's red tennis shoes, All Might was already there, easily maneuvering the tactical gear off the boy's foot, making a point to remove the shoes too. "Let me." "Vlad's taking everyone back to the classroom and then to the dorm," the blonde remarked lowly. "Says he'll grab Yamada and Kayama to help." Sapphire caught Onyx, a sharp expression swirling in those normally affable orbs, and it made Shoyuta pause a moment to consider the connections between the boy who'd shuddered in sleep and unconsciousness, and the blonde one-time symbol of peace. There was so much left unsaid between them, so many unanswered curiosities yet to explore and pick at. "What happened?" he wanted to say, demand, interrogate. "What did you do? What do you know?" Because there was a feeling between them, each teacher tending to the boy. Yet there was a tenseness, a concern and a sense of unease from All Might. As though he were hiding something. Something important. Something to do with problem child. Medic bot from Recovery Girl.